The Valkyrie's Beast Master. Act 1, The Sink and the Sword. Chapter 1, The Price of Salt and Ash. Somewhere between the dying fire and the living forest, the village of Calder's Reach had been burning for 3 hours before Issei Hyoudou arrived. He came from the north road, moving at a pace that swallowed distance without appearing to hurry. He wore a long travel coat the color of dry earth, its collar turned up against the autumn wind, and beneath it the dark layered armor he had welded together from a dozen different contracts. His hair was brown and slightly overgrown, and his eyes, the color of dark amber, swept the treeline with the automatic precision of someone who had long ago traded surprise for vigilance. Smoke rose in 3 pillars from what remained of the settlement. He counted the pillars before he counted anything else. 1 from the granary. 1 from the meeting hall. 1 from the stables on the eastern edge. That meant the fire had not started accidentally. Accidents started at hearths, at forges, at lanterns knocked over by sleepy hands. 3 separate points of origin meant 3 separate torches. Deliberate erasure. He did not run. Running announced you. He walked, which was something that mercenaries and hunters understood and civilians rarely did. The ground told him things as he crossed the outer fence. Boot prints in the mud, heavy-soled, uniform spacing. Church issue combat sandals, the kind with the reinforced toe and the flat heel designed for long marches. He counted at least 14 distinct sets moving inward. He counted 4 sets moving outward, and those 4 sets were spaced wider, the stride longer. They had been carrying something. Calder's Reach was a border settlement, one of several dozen that existed in the gray space between the feudal territories of the Western Lords and the wild country beyond. Those gray spaces had always attracted people who did not fit elsewhere. Half-bloods. Wanderers. Creatures who wore human shapes during the day and other shapes at night, who asked only to be left alone in exchange for honest labor, and the occasional healing herb left at a sick neighbor's door. The Church of the Sacred Flame did not believe in leaving such people alone. Issei had been 3 days east when the messenger found him. A boy of 12, running barefoot with a folded letter that had been written in a shaking hand. The letter said they took Myrna, and they took the others, and they said they were taking them to the hollow for purification, and please, if you are the one they call the Beast Master, please come. He had folded the letter, tucked it away, and changed direction without a word. Now he stood at the center of what had been Calder's Reach's main square and let himself go still. Not physically still. He was always moving slightly, weight shifting, fingers loose. But the deeper part of him, the part that had no good name in any language he had learned, went quiet. Receptive. The part the old woman in the eastern hills had called the listening place, when she had first noticed it in him and spent 3 weeks trying to explain what it was. He breathed. And the world breathed back. It had started when he was 9 years old, with a dying wolf. He had found it in a ditch at the edge of his father's farmland, a large gray male with an arrow through its shoulder and 3 broken ribs from a bad fall. It should have been dead already. Something in its eyes when it looked up at him had been so entirely without hope that Issei had sat down in the mud beside it without thinking, and the instinct that moved through him in that moment had not been fear. He had pressed his palm against the wolf's side and felt something pass between them. Not warmth exactly. More like a frequency. Like 2 strings of different lengths suddenly vibrating at the same pitch. The wolf did not heal. That was not how it worked, as he would come to understand only much later. But it had stopped fighting the pain. It had looked at him with those amber eyes, and he had understood, with absolute clarity, that it was very tired and it was not afraid and it would have liked, in another life, to run the ridge above the valley one more time. He had stayed with it until it died. And when it died, something small and bright had stayed with him. He had never been able to fully explain it, and had stopped trying by the time he was 12. The simple fact was that he could sync. With living things, with creatures, with the layered consciousness of beings that other people saw as animals or monsters or threats. When he synced with something, he did not control it. He did not own it. He touched it, and it touched him, and for the duration of the sync they understood each other completely. The church had a word for people who could do what he did. They had several words, actually, and none of them were kind. He found the first survivor in the root cellar beneath the collapsed baker's shop. She was small and she was pressed into the far corner behind an overturned barrel, and when he lifted the cellar hatch and the gray daylight fell on her face, he saw the ridge of scales along her jaw and the way her pupils went vertical with fear. She was perhaps 17, with dark red hair matted with ash and a torn work tunic that had at some point been a reasonable brown and was now the color of disaster. Her hands were wrapped around her own arms so tightly that the knuckles had gone pale. He did not speak immediately. He sat on the edge of the cellar hatch, feet dangling into the dark, and waited. This was something the wolf had taught him. The thing that most people called patience was actually something else. It was the willingness to let another creature take you at their own speed. The exorcists left, he said, when the silence had been long enough. 14 in, 4 out with prisoners. The rest rode north. You are not in danger right now. Her pupils did not change. But her hands loosened slightly. Are you one of them? Her voice was careful. Controlled. Someone who had learned to modulate her voice the way you modulated a fire, keeping it from giving off too much heat. No. What are you? A mercenary. Someone sent for me. He paused. Myrna's family sent for me, I think. Or what was left of it. Something crossed her face. Pain quickly armored. Myrna was taken. Along with her mother, and old Cass, and the twins from the mill, and... She stopped. Several others. I know. I am going after them. He looked at her steadily. You can come or you can stay. If you stay, I would go north. The church won't be back today, but their patrols rotate. She looked at him for a long time. Her eyes were very dark, and the scales along her jaw caught what little light came through the hatch and fractured it into small prismatic points. A lizardkin, he thought. Partial heritage, clearly. The church called them scaled abominations. He had met 3 or 4 over the years, and they had been, without exception, more courteous than most of the humans he worked for. My name is Sera, she said. Issei. She unfolded herself from the corner with surprising grace. I know how to fight, she said. It was not a boast. It was information, delivered plainly. Good, he said, and reached down to help her up. Chapter 2, The Hollow Road. 14 miles through the great pines. The Hollow was a name that the locals used for a place the church called the reclamation station at Calder's Crossing, which was a name that the church used for a place that was, in practice, a holding facility. Issei had been to 2 like it in the past 4 years. He had not enjoyed either visit. They moved through the grey pine forest at a pace that Sera matched without complaint, which told him a great deal about her. She kept her footfalls quiet without being asked. She watched the canopy as well as the ground, which was the mark of someone who had spent time moving through territory where threats could come from above. When he held up a fist to signal a stop, she stopped before the motion was complete, which meant she was watching him from his periphery rather than directly. Field experience. Not the practice kind that you got from formal training, but the instinctive kind that grew from having been hunted. How long have you lived in Calder's Reach? He asked, during a brief pause while he read the track markings at a fork in the path. 3 years. My mother brought us there when I was 14. She crouched beside him without being asked and studied the prints he was studying. The heavier prints are from armored boots. The dragged impressions are from people being pulled. She pointed. 4 pairs of drag marks. The prisoners. Yes. He looked at her sideways. You can read tracks. My mother taught me. She said that if you can read the land can talk to you. A brief pause. She is one of the ones they took. He said nothing for a moment. Then, we will get them out. You sound very certain of that. I have done it before. She studied his face for a moment. The vertical pupils of her lizardkin heritage gave her expression a quality that humans often found unsettling, a sense of being assessed from angles you could not quite identify. They say the Beast Master can speak to monsters, she said. They say he travels with creatures that would terrify a normal person, and that he commands them like a general commands soldiers. I don't command, he said. I think. It is different. What is the difference? He thought about this for a moment. It was a question he had been asked before, and he had never found an answer that felt complete. Command is one voice speaking to a silent other. Sync is two voices speaking at the same time, and finding that they were already saying the same thing. Sera was quiet for a moment. Then she made a small sound that might have been the beginning of something, and looked back at the tracks. "We should move," she said. "Yes," he agreed, and they moved. 2 miles south of the hollow, they encountered the first of the others. Issei heard her before he saw her. Not with his ears. With the listening place. A tight, compressed knot of pain and fury and territorial instinct, pressed into the fork of a tall pine about 30 feet off the road. He stopped walking, and Sera stopped with him. He looked up. At first he saw nothing. Then the shadows in the pine's upper branches shifted, and he saw 2 eyes watching him. Yellow gold, wide, with the faint luminosity of a creature whose vision extended beyond the normal spectrum. A pair of long ears, tufted at the tips, flat against the skull. A tail, long and striped, pressed against the bark for balance. A catkin. Half human, half something that was not entirely cat and not entirely anything else, with a heritage that the old texts called felis sublime and that most people called dangerous. She was wrapped in a traveling cloak that had been badly torn along one side, and the arm she held against her chest was clearly injured. She was staring at him with the focused, unblinking attention of a creature deciding whether to flee or attack. He did not reach for his weapons. He reached inward instead, toward the listening place, and let it expand outward in the way that he could never quite explain to anyone who had not felt it themselves. It was not a signal exactly. More like an opening. More like a door unlocking from the inside. The response, when it came, was like a slap. Pain. Anger. Fear layered beneath the anger like bedrock beneath thin soil. And underneath all of it, something very still and very tired, the same quality he had felt in the dying wolf all those years ago. Not hopelessness. But the specific exhaustion of someone who has been fighting alone for too long. He let her feel that he felt all of that. That was all the sync required, in moments like this. Not words. Acknowledgement. The catkin dropped from the tree in one fluid motion, landing without sound, and stood on the road in front of them. She was slightly shorter than Sera, with dark hair shot through with amber that matched her eyes, and a jaw set with a stubbornness that was entirely human. The arm she cradled was wrapped in a makeshift bandage made from her cloak's lining, and the blood that had soaked through it was old and dark. "You are going to the hollow," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," Issei said. "My sister is inside." She looked at him with those yellow gold eyes. "They took her 4 days ago. I followed them. I tried to get in." She looked at her arm. "The ward stones around the perimeter are keyed to felis heritage. They hurt. Church-made ward stones usually are." He studied the arm. "Your injury needs cleaning and binding properly. We have 10 minutes before we need to move if we want to reach the hollow before the evening guard rotation. Can you use that arm for climbing?" She blinked. Something shifted in her expression, a fractional loosening of the set jaw. "If I have to." "Good enough." He unslung the small pack he carried and found the wound kit without looking. "My name is Issei. This is Sera. What is yours?" "Kale," she said. She watched him begin to redress her arm with a wariness that did not diminish but gradually changed quality, becoming less the wariness of fear and more the wariness of someone who had decided to reserve judgment. "They say you can talk to monsters. That is the second time today someone has said that to me. Is it true? I can sync with non-human beings. Whether that counts as talking depends on how you define the word." He tied off the fresh bandage with efficient fingers. "It is true that I prefer the company of most non-humans to most humans. If that makes me a monster whisperer, then yes." Kale looked at the bandage, then at him. Something in her expression had shifted again. "My sister's name is Mira," she said. "She is 11 years old, and she cannot fully shift between forms yet. She has been inside that facility for 4 days. The listening place went very quiet. "Let's move," he said. Chapter 3. Ward Stones and Iron Doors. The architecture of a cage. The reclamation station at Calder's Crossing had been built with the particular competence that the church applied to all projects it considered morally necessary. It was not beautiful. It was thorough. A long low building of fitted gray stone, windowless on 3 sides, with iron-banded doors at the entrance and at the loading bay. Around the perimeter, at intervals of roughly 15 feet, stood the ward stones, smooth columns of pale granite etched with sigils that Issei recognized from the texts on suppression architecture that he had spent 2 winters memorizing. They lay in the brush on the ridge above the facility, and studied it in the fading afternoon light. 14 church soldiers in the compound. Issei counted them twice through different sight lines and arrived at the same number. They moved in 4-person rotation patterns around the perimeter, with 2 stationed permanently at the main door and 2 at the loading bay. The rotation cycle was 12 minutes. He tracked it for 48 minutes to be certain. 2 rooftop positions, Sera murmured beside him. She was lying flat, chin to the earth, her lizardkin pupils working the available light with an efficiency that human eyes could not match. East and west corners. They have crossbows. The rooftop sentries rotate every 20 minutes, not 12, Cale added from his other side. She had been watching the roof with the focused attention of someone whose survival instincts ran in the same frequency as the creatures she shared heritage with. The one on the east corner favors his left side. He was injured recently and not fully healed. Good eyes, Issei said quietly. He studied the ward stones. The suppression field is the primary problem. It will alert the soldiers inside the moment anything with a non-human heritage crosses the perimeter. That includes both of you, and several of the people inside. Can you cross it? Sera asked. I am entirely human. I cross without triggering anything. He was quiet for a moment. But I cannot extract multiple prisoners through a combat zone alone. Then what do we do? He had been thinking about this since he studied the facility's schematics in his memory. He had a copy of the standard church suppression layout, obtained at significant cost from a disenchanted church engineer 2 years ago. The ward stones were the problem. But ward stones were powered by a central conduit stone, usually placed inside the facility, and conduit stones were not indestructible. I go in first, he said. I find the conduit stone and I collapse it. When the ward field goes down, you 2 move on the east side, target the rooftop sentries. He looked at Cale. Can you reach that height quickly? She showed him a look that contained several layers, the outermost being mild offense, and the innermost being grim confidence. Faster than you can count to 3. I will believe that when I see it. He said it flatly, and she understood it as the compliment he meant rather than the dismissal it sounded like. Sera, I need you to understand the ward stone sigils. If any of the stones are still partially active when the conduit drops, touching them will be painful. Sera looked at him with those dark eyes and their vertical pupils. How painful! You will know which ones are still active because they will glow. Avoid the glowing ones. That, she said, is excellent advice in general. He almost smiled. It was a small motion that rarely made it to the surface, but it happened. There is one more thing. He had been sitting with this part of the plan for the entire approach, turning it over, looking for a cleaner option and not finding one. Inside the facility, they will likely have at least one contained creature. The church uses them as internal deterrents. Captive beasts, suppressed but not destroyed. I will need to deal with that. Deal with it how? Cale asked. I will sync with it and offer it a choice. A silence settled over the 3 of them. The wind moved through the gray pines. Below them, a sentry completed his patrol rotation and turned back. What choice do you offer a captive creature? Sera asked. The same choice I would want if I were one, Issei said. Whether to stay or to leave. Whether to fight or to rest. Whether to trust. Another silence. Then Cale, and if it does not trust? Then I deal with that outcome as it comes. He looked at them both. This is not a plan that accounts for every variable. It is a plan that accounts for the first 3 moves. After that, we improvise. I can work with that, Sera said. I can work with that, Cale said, which surprised him slightly and pleased him more than he showed. He checked the angle of the fading sun. 20 minutes of useful light left. The evening guard rotation would happen at full dark, which would bring all 14 soldiers briefly to the main courtyard for the handoff briefing. That was his window. When the sun touches the pine ridge, he said, we move. He went over the outer wall at the spot he had identified, a 12-foot section between two ward stones where the suppression field had a natural gap, caused by the slight misalignment of the conduit channel beneath the foundation. Church engineers were thorough, but they were not perfect. No one was. The courtyard was empty of sentries for 11 seconds between patrol rotations. He crossed it in 7. The loading bay door was secured with a crossbar and a church standard lock that he had learned to open 4 years ago from a woman who had been a church locksmith before she had a crisis of conscience. He worked it in the dark by touch alone, the way she had taught him, feeling for the give points in the mechanism rather than trying to see them. The door opened. The smell hit him first. Stone, iron, and beneath both of those the particular scent of suppression sigil oil, which the church used to maintain the ward architecture, and which smelled like burned copper and old fear. He moved inside and let his eyes adjust to the interior darkness. A long corridor. Doors on both sides iron, with small barred windows. He heard breathing from several of them, slow and careful, the breathing of people trying not to draw attention to themselves. He kept moving. The conduit stone would be at the geometric center of the building. He had measured the exterior dimensions from the ridge and calculated the approximate location. He found it in a small room off the main corridor. A sphere of pale granite about the size of his head, mounted in an iron cradle and pulsing with a slow, cold light. The suppression sigils etched on its surface were active and fully charged. He set his palm against it. The pain was immediate and significant. He had known it would be. Suppression architecture was designed to harm non-human beings, but the conduit stones themselves were sensitive to any interference, and overloading the field from the outside was not painless. He breathed through it, finding the pattern of the pulse, and then pushed against it, not with force. With sync. It was a strange thing to sync with a stone. The old woman in the eastern hills had told him it was impossible, that sync only worked with living things. He had discovered, through 3 years of painful experimentation, that she was mostly right. Conduit stones were not living, but they were not fully inert either. The sigil architecture that powered them carried a kind of functional echo, the residue of the belief and will that had been pressed into them during their crafting. That echo had a frequency. He found the frequency and he pressed against it from the inside, not pushing, not forcing, but simply making the stone aware of something that did not match its purpose. An incompatibility. A discord. The stone went dark. The suppression field collapsed. Somewhere in the facility, someone shouted. Somewhere above him, he heard the rapid shift of boot steps on the roof. And from the corridor beyond the room, he heard the sound of a cell door being pushed outward from the inside, which meant one of the prisoners had been leaning against it and waiting. He went back into the corridor. Chapter 4. What Lives in the Dark. The Thing in the Last Cell. The prisoners were 7 in number, which was 3 more than the messenger boy's letter had suggested. They ranged from a woman in her mid-40s who moved with the bone-deep caution of someone carrying old injuries, to a pair of twins who could not have been more than 15 and who stood with their backs against each other in the way of young creatures that had learned early that the world was not reliably safe. Myrna was there. He recognized her from the description in the letter, tall for her age, dark-haired, with the faint iridescent quality to her skin that marked her partial nymph heritage. She was 16 and she had clearly been crying, and she had also clearly stopped, and the expression on her face when she saw him was the expression of someone who had decided that crying could be resumed later, when there was time. He ran a quick assessment. No serious injuries among the 7. Exhausted, frightened, malnourished from 4 days on minimal rations, but ambulatory. He could work with ambulatory. My name is Issei, he said, keeping his voice low and steady. I am going to get you out. There are 2 people outside who will help us move. Does anyone here have difficulty running? The older woman, the one with the careful movement that spoke of old injuries, raised her hand. My knee. I can move, but not quickly. You will be at the center of the group. The pace will match yours. He looked at each face. 7 sets of eyes looking back, carrying different proportions of fear and relief and the particular complicated emotion that was both of those things at once. Is everyone accounted for? Is anyone not here who should be? One of the twins, the girl, looked at the far end of the corridor. There is something in the last cell, she said. Her voice was very young and very steady. They brought it here 2 days ago. It has been making sounds. He had been aware of the last cell since he entered the corridor. The listening place had been tracking it without his conscious direction, the way a compass tracked north. There was something there. Something with a frequency that was not human and not any creature he recognized immediately, but that was present in the way that only living things were present. Go to the loading bay, he told the prisoners. There will be sounds of fighting from the outside. Do not stop moving until you are through the door and 20 feet clear of the building. Understood? Nods. Myrna was the one who herded the others into motion, which told him everything he needed to know about her. He went to the last cell. The lock was heavier than the others. A double crossbar with a sigil seal overlay, which meant the church had considered whatever was inside to be a significant threat. He worked through the lock with the same patience he applied to everything, and opened the door. The creature inside was chained. She was roughly humanoid, roughly female, and roughly the same age as Myrna, though he suspected her actual age was considerably greater. Her heritage was harder to categorize than the lizardkin or the catkin. There was something lupin in the structure of her jaw and the quality of her hands, which were long-fingered and ended in nails that had been blunted with iron caps. Her hair was the color of deep frost, nearly white, and her eyes, when they opened and looked at him, were the pale gray of a winter sky with no clouds, which was to say they were the color of something that had given up being decorative and become purely functional. She had been here longer than 4 days. The chains told that story. The manner in which she wore them told a longer one. There was no strain in her posture, no sign of someone who had spent days fighting her restraints. She had gone somewhere else inside herself while the outside waited, which was the behavior of a very particular kind of creature, one that understood cycles of captivity and freedom not as aberrations but as the ordinary rhythm of its existence. He did not like that. He reached toward the listening place. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Endurance. Vast, cold, patient endurance. Not resignation, not defeat, but something more structural than either of those, a quality like granite, like deep root systems, like the kind of anger that has had long enough to become architecture. And beneath all of that, something warm and very old, the specific warmth of loyalty, the frequency he had felt in pack animals and herd creatures, the instinct that said my people before I. He crouched in front of her. I am going to remove the chains, he said, if you are willing. Her gray eyes regarded him. You are not church, she said. Her voice was low and roughened from disuse. No. What are you? A mercenary. I came for the prisoners. I am a prisoner. Yes, he said. Are you willing to let me remove the chains? A pause. Longer than the pauses he had experienced with Sera and Kale, which told him this one had more to process, or more to lose, or had been burned by the equivalent question too many times before. The cap on my right hand, she said. Remove it, and I can work the chains myself. He removed the iron cap. Her right hand flexed once, and then her fingers worked the chain lock with a precision that told him it had not been the first time she had tried, only the first time she had the right tool. The chains dropped. She stood. She was taller than he had estimated from the crouch. She looked at him from that height for a moment, and then she looked at the open door, and then she looked back at him with those winter sky eyes. There are soldiers outside, he said. My companions are handling them. We are extracting 7 other prisoners. The exit is through the loading bay. I do not run, she said. It was the same quality of information that Sera had delivered in the root cellar. Not a boast. A fact. Then walk quickly. Something happened at the corner of her mouth. It might have been the ghost of a thing that was not quite a smile. My name is Vael, she said. Issei. He stepped aside to let her through the door. We can exchange histories later. Right now I need to know if those iron caps affected your combat capability significantly. She looked at her unbound hand, and then at the long corridor, and then at him. Significantly, she confirmed. Then stay behind me until we are clear of the building. I do not stay behind others, she said, and walked past him into the corridor. He followed, filing the observation away, and thinking that whatever the next several hours brought, They were going to be interesting. Chapter 5, The Courtyard Fight. 14 against 3, which was not good math. The sounds of fighting outside had been audible since he freed the second prisoner, and by the time he reached the loading bay they had resolved into something more specific. 2 distinct combat signatures moving in different rhythms, one that was fluid and precise and one that was sharp and fast and furious, operating at frequencies that his tactical sense could track even without seeing the source. Sera and Kale were not losing. But they were outnumbered, and the mathematics of attrition did not improve with time. He held up a hand to the prisoners. Myrna stopped the group without needing to be told, which confirmed his assessment of her. He looked at Vael. "How are the iron cap effects?" "Improving," she said. She was opening and closing her right hand with a methodical focus, the joints moving through their range of motion as she worked blood and function back into the numbed fingers. "Can you hold this position if any of the soldiers come through the bay door?" She looked at the door. She looked at the 7 prisoners. She looked at him with those pale gray eyes that contained, he was beginning to understand, a great deal more than they showed. "Yes," she said. "I will be back within 4 minutes. I will be here," she said. And then, with a quality in her voice that was not quite wry and not quite dry but lived in the neighborhood of both, "I am quite experienced at staying in one place." He was already moving through the door. The courtyard was chaos organized into manageable sectors, which was the best thing that could be said about it. Kale had taken the east rooftop, which explained the absence of crossbow fire. She was moving along the roof edge with the easy contempt for gravity that full Catkin shift enabled, and the east sentry was no longer at his post, which implied he had made the poor decision to challenge her directly. 3 soldiers in the courtyard were clustered around the point where she had come down off the wall, moving carefully, which was the right tactical response but was still going to end poorly for them because she was no longer where they were looking. Sera had taken the main courtyard approach and was currently occupying the full attention of 6 soldiers, which was extraordinary. She moved in a style that Issei could not immediately categorize, a fluid combination of close and grappling and the use of her own scales as defensive architecture, turning her body so that weapons that would have cut through cloth or soft armor instead skittered off the natural plating along her forearms and shoulders. She was controlled and precise and very dangerous, and she was also taking small hits, accumulating the kind of damage that would not matter for 20 minutes and would matter enormously after. The remaining 5 soldiers were moving toward the loading bay. He intercepted them. He fought the way a working mercenary fought, which was to say without artistry or apparent style but with an economy of motion that eliminated all movement which did not produce an outcome. He had been in enough contracted actions over the past decade that combat had long since ceased to be a matter of instinct, and become instead a matter of logistics. Each opponent was a problem with a specific solution. The solution was to put them on the ground as quickly as possible using the minimum resources necessary. He put the first soldier down with a pressure strike to the radial nerve cluster that took the crossbow out of the equation without requiring anything dramatic. The second he redirected into the third, a simple geometry problem that resolved when the third soldier tried to swing wide and found his footing compromised by the edge of the loading bay step. The fourth was faster than the others and had real training behind his movements, church standard hand-to-hand, the kind drilled into exorcist core, and this one required actual attention rather than applied geometry. He synced with the man, not to harm him, not to control him, just to touch. To find the frequency and let the man feel, for one single unguarded moment, that the creature he was fighting was not an aberration or a threat but simply a person, and that the people he had helped imprison in that building were exactly the same. It lasted less than a second. But it was long enough. The soldier stopped mid-swing. The hesitation was just a fraction of a moment, barely a breath, but it was enough for Issei to redirect the momentum and bring the engagement to a clean conclusion. The 5th soldier looked at the 4 on the ground and at Issei standing among them and made the practical decision to retreat toward the main gate. Issei let him go. The church would know about the raid by morning regardless. There was no tactical value in elimination that was not operationally necessary. Loading bay, he called to Sera and Kale. Now. They moved the prisoners out through the loading bay and north through the pine forest, moving in a column that Issei led and Vael brought up at the rear without being asked, which told him that she was thinking tactically rather than personally. Kale moved on the right flank, 12 feet out, visible occasionally through the tree gaps. Sera kept position on his left shoulder, her breathing controlled despite the minor wounds she was managing. They stopped 3 miles into the forest, at a natural depression between 2 large boulders that provided wind shelter and a defensible position with 2 visible approaches. The 7 former prisoners settled into the space. Myrna organized the more exhausted ones with a quiet authority that was, he thought, going to be a significant asset to whatever life she was going back to. The older woman with the injured knee, who had told him her name was cast during the march, was already checking on the twins with the focused attention of long practice. Issei stood at the edge of the group and looked back along the trail. Nothing following yet. That would likely change by morning. Sera arrived beside him with that particular quality of presence she had, filling the space she occupied without announcing it. The facility will send runners to the nearest church garrison, she said quietly. 40 miles east. The garrison will mobilize a pursuit unit. Figure 8 hours minimum before they are in these woods. He looked at the sky. Stars clear, the moon in its first quarter. We move again at first light and split routes. I will take the non-human members of our group east through the verdant pass. The human prisoners can follow the pilgrim road back to their families. The church will not pursue humans without specific evidence of non-human harboring. And us? Kale had appeared from the right flank without sound, as she apparently preferred to do. She sat on a rock at the edge of the depression and looked at him with those yellow-gold eyes. Where do we go after the pass? He had been thinking about that. The honest answer was that he had not planned past the extraction, because planning past the extraction was a habit he had learned to avoid. Plans made beyond the immediate problem had a tendency to assume a future that was not guaranteed. But there was Kale's sister, still inside some church facility somewhere. There were others like her. There had always been others like her. And the 4 of them, the 5 of them counting Vael, had just demonstrated a specific operational capability that, if properly organized, represented a genuine answer to a problem that had needed answering for years. There is a place in the Verdant Highlands, he said. A way station I have used before. Defensible. Off the church's active maps. He paused. We can discuss next steps there. Vael was standing 6 feet behind him, which he was aware of the way he was aware of all things in his immediate perimeter. She had not spoken since the loading bay. She had not needed to. Her presence occupied its own frequency, steady and cold, and underneath both of those things, attentive. The sister, she said now? Her voice was quiet. Kale's sister. Yes. He looked at Kale. We will find her. Kale looked at him for a long moment. The tufted ears, lowered during the fight, had come back up. Her tail, which he had observed moving through a series of positions that telegraphed her emotional state with the unconscious honesty of someone who had not yet learned to manage it, was still. You do not know where she is, she said. Not yet. But you intend to find out. Yes. Another long look. Then she turned and sat facing the dark forest, which was, he had come to understand in the past several hours, Kale's way of saying that she had decided to believe something and was not going to discuss it further. He sat down on the ground with his back against a boulder and looked at the first quarter moon and thought about what came next. Somewhere in the forest around them, something small and warm-blooded moved through the underbrush. He felt it in the listening place, a tiny frequency, frightened of the smell of blood and smoke but curious in the way that small creatures were always curious. He let the frequency settle into the back of his awareness, let it become part of the ambient, and sat with the cold and the stars and the particular complicated weight of a night that had not gone as badly as it could have gone but had also not resolved anything. It had, if anything, only just begun. Chapter 6, The Verdant Pass. What a way station holds. They walked through the night and into the pale gray of early morning, and by the time the sun had climbed 2 hands above the eastern ridgeline they had reached the base of the Verdant Pass and the way station that Issei had described. It was not impressive. This was, he had learned, the primary quality that made it valuable. A low stone building, half embedded in a hillside in a manner that made it look more like a geological formation than a structure, with a turf roof that blended into the hillside above it in every season except deep winter. The door was solid oak, 3 inches thick, set in a stone frame. Inside, a main room with a fireplace, a supply cache in the floor beneath a flagstone, a ladder to a sleeping loft that ran the length of the building, and a secondary exit through the back wall that opened onto a scramble path going up the hillside. He had established it 5 years ago, after the 3rd time he had needed a safe house and not had one. He had been methodical about it. The supply cache was rotated annually. The secondary exit was known to no one he had not personally vouched for. The location appeared on no church map and on exactly one map that he possessed and kept in his head rather than on paper. The 7 former prisoners from Calder's reach rested there through the morning. He had arranged, the previous night during the march, for Myrna to guide them back to the lowland settlements by a route that avoided church roads. She had accepted this with the quiet competence that had characterized everything she did, and he had watched the 7 of them disappear into the dawnlit forest with a satisfaction that was mostly professional, and just slightly more than that. Sera, Vael, and Vael remained. He was not surprised. He had not been surprised since the root cellar in Calder's reach. Sera sat by the fire with her knees drawn up and her arms resting on them, dressing her minor wounds with the methodical attention of someone who had learned long ago to see wound management as a practical task rather than a distressing one. The scales along her jaw and forearms caught the firelight and threw back small warm reflections, and her vertical pupils tracked the room with the comprehensive awareness of lizardkin heritage at rest. Vael was in the sleeping loft. He could hear her moving occasionally, the restless movement of someone too tired to sleep but too exhausted to stay alert. Twice he heard her stop moving entirely for long stretches, and both times the frequency in the listening place told him she was doing something with her grief that she was not going to discuss. He gave her the space that grief required. Vael sat at the table in the center of the room. She had not eaten the food he had put out, though he noticed she had moved it closer to her hand in a way that suggested she was aware of it. She was examining her right hand with a sustained focus that was, he understood after watching her for a few minutes, not actually about her hand. She was recalibrating. Running internal systems checks after captivity, the way any operational creature did after a period of forced dormancy. He made tea. It was a practical thing to do and a social one at the same time, and he had found over many years that the act of making tea in a tense room was the most reliable way to reduce the tension without acknowledging it. He set a cup in front of Vael. She looked at it, then at him, and then she picked it up and held it in both hands, and something in the set of her shoulders changed by a barely perceptible degree. "How long were you in that cell?" he asked. 12 days. "What are you?" He said it plainly, with no weight of judgment. It was the same question she had asked him in the cell. She considered the question with the patience of someone who had given it thought before. "Lobizin," she said. "Full heritage. Both parents, several generations back on both lines." The iron caps suppressed the shift, which is why they used them rather than chains alone. Lobizin. He filed the word carefully. He had heard it twice before, in texts that were at least 200 years old. A classification over heritage that was older than the Church's taxonomy, older than the current political arrangements between the Church and the feudal territories, older than most of the agreements that governed the grey country he moved through. Full Lobizin heritage was considered extinct by most Church scholars. "You are not extinct," he observed. "No," she agreed. "Does the Church know what you are?" "No. They classified me as standard wolfskin and acted accordingly." Her pale gray eyes met his. "If they had known, they would have treated my containment differently. More securely? More permanently." He understood what she meant. He sat down across from her. "Are there others? Others like me?" She considered this. "Not many. We are not a numerous people, even in the best centuries." A pause, just long enough to be deliberate. "My people do not typically ask for help from outside our own lines. We consider it a sign of failure. And yet here you are. And yet here I am," she agreed. Something moved through her expression, complex and carefully managed. "I will not pretend that does not create certain." She chose the next word with obvious care. "Obligations. I did not free you because I wanted obligations from you. I know. That is part of why I am still here. The fire crackled. Somewhere in the loft, Kale had stopped moving. I am not building a unit, he said, because he thought she should hear it plainly. I am not recruiting. What happened last night was a single operation with a clear objective. If you all continue north or east or in whatever direction serves you, that is entirely appropriate. Vael looked at him over the rim of her teacup with those winter sky eyes. You believe that, she said? I can tell that you believe it. But the girl in the loft has a sister inside a church facility. And the lizardkin by the fire came from a settlement that no longer exists. And I. She paused. I have been running alone for 3 years, and the church has been actively hunting what I am for 2 of them. Continuing north or east or in whatever direction serves me is not a plan. It is a delay. He looked at her for a moment. Kale's sister, he said. If I find her, it will require at least one more operation like last night's. Possibly more complex. The church will be aware that someone extracted prisoners from the Calder's crossing facility, and they will have increased security protocols at all related sites. Yes, she said. That is not a comfortable situation to walk into voluntarily. I have not been comfortable in 3 years, she said, and her voice was perfectly level when she said it, and that levelness was its own kind of answer. From the sleeping loft, Kale's voice came down, quiet, controlled, the voice of someone who had been listening and had decided that was enough. You should both sleep. I will take first watch. Sera, by the fire, made a small sound that was not quite a laugh. She has been awake longer than any of us. I am fine, Kale said. That, Sera said to no one in particular, is the most alarming thing she has said all day. Issei looked around the small, warm room. The firelight moved across 3 faces, all different, all carrying their own histories and their own reasons for being here. The listening place hummed quietly with the overlapping frequencies of their different natures, wolf and lizard and cat, and beneath all of those the steady human frequency that was his own. He thought about the church garrison mobilizing 40 miles east. He thought about the facility that held Kale's sister. He thought about the pattern of raids and suppressions and controlled burns that had characterized the past 3 years across the Grey Country, escalating with a systematic quality that implied coordination at a level above individual garrison commanders. He thought about the engineer who had sold him the suppression schematics, and the things she had said before she died, about new protocols and new authorization levels and a name that had come up repeatedly in the orders she had seen. He thought about the kind of operation that would be required to do something meaningful about all of that. The logistics of it. The personnel. The specific, strange, unprecedented combination of capabilities that had emerged from a single afternoon of necessity in Calder's reach. He put those thoughts away. For now. I will take second watch, he said. Sleep. He banked the fire, checked the door, checked the secondary exit, and sat in the chair nearest the door with his back to the wall and his eyes on the room, and the listening place spread outward into the dark outside, touching the small nighttime frequencies of the forest, cataloging, monitoring, and finding nothing that was not exactly what it should be. The night passed. In the morning, there would be decisions to make. But morning had not come yet, and for now the fire burned low and the 3 of them slept, and Issei kept his watch. And somewhere beyond the dark ridgeline the church moved toward a confrontation it did not yet know was coming. Chapter 7. Information has weight. What the dead engineer knew. He told them about the engineer on the second morning. Her name had been Durette, and she had spent 16 years in church service as a suppression architect, which was the technical title for the people who designed and maintained the ward stone networks. She had come to him 18 months ago through a chain of referrals too complicated to summarize, with a leather satchel full of copied schematics and a face that had the specific quality of someone who had crossed the line they had spent a long time approaching. She had been dead for 11 months. A road accident outside the eastern towns that was almost certainly not an accident. The satchel and its contents had been with him since 3 days before her death, when she had sent them ahead with a messenger and a note that said, "If you are reading this without me, you know why." He spread the copied schematics on the waystation table and let the 3 of them look. Sera studied the documents with the focused attention of someone with at least passing familiarity with architectural notation. Kale paced along the far wall, which was her preferred way of processing information, her tail moving in slow arcs that he had learned to read as a barometer of her level of agitation. Vael read the schematics without touching them, which he understood was a lobazin courtesy, a thing that was hers still being his until he offered it. These are the suppression networks for 5 facilities, Sera said. Including. She found the Calder's crossing schematic among the 5. Yes. This is the one we were in last night. The other 4 are distributed across the Grey Country, he said. Dirette believed they were part of a coordinated project called the Reclamation Initiative. The goal, as she understood it from the orders she processed, was to catalog and contain every non-human heritage individual within the Church's operational jurisdiction by the end of a 3-year window. Silence. That is not possible, Kale said. She was not pacing anymore. There are too many of us. Across too many places. They cannot do it completely, he agreed. But they do not need to do it completely. They need to do it sufficiently. If they can reduce the visible population of non-human heritage individuals below a certain threshold, the political and social argument for the Grey Country settlements collapses. The settlements exist because enough people in the feudal territories consider them tolerable. Remove enough of the people from the settlements, and the argument becomes that the settlements were empty to begin with. Vael looked up from the schematics. The 3-year window. How much of it remains? Dirette's letter was written 14 months ago. She believed the initiative was approximately 18 months into its 3-year schedule, so 4 months. Perhaps less. Perhaps more, if they have encountered logistical problems. Sera sat back from the table. The firelight moved across the ridge of scales along her jaw. 4 months, she said. To do what? He had thought about this. He had been thinking about it, with varying degrees of focus, for 11 months. The initiative runs through 5 facilities, he said. Those facilities are networked through a central coordination point, which Dirette identified as a command station in the Aldmark Highlands. If the coordination point is disrupted, the facility network loses its authorization structure. Facilities operating without authorization cannot legally hold prisoners under church law. They can physically hold them, but they lose the administrative framework that makes the holding invisible. You want to attack the command station, Kale said. I want to make the Reclamation Initiative operationally non-viable, he said. Attacking the command station is one component. Freeing the prisoners from at least 3 of the 5 facilities before the 4-month window closes is another. Documenting and disseminating the evidence of what the initiative has been doing is a third. Vael regarded him with those pale gray eyes. You have been planning this for 11 months, she said. Yes. Alone. Yes. And you came to Calder's Reach because of a letter from a 12-year-old boy. Yes. She looked at him for a long moment. What does the plan look like with 4 people? Better than it looked with 1. Kale stopped pacing. She leaned against the far wall with her arms crossed and her tail very still. The second facility, she said. Show me. He found the second schematic and laid it flat. This is the facility at Moorgate Station. Dirette's notes suggest it is the largest of the 5, with capacity for 30 to 40 prisoners. She also noted that it holds a secondary suppression archive, which is where the Church stores the genealogical records it uses to identify non-human heritage individuals. Destroying that archive would be as valuable as the prisoner extraction itself. How far? Sera asked. 3 days' travel north and east. The terrain favors movement by small groups. He paused. The security will be heavier than Calder's Crossing. Dirette noted that Moorgate has a dedicated combat unit of 6 church exorcists in addition to standard garrison soldiers. The exorcists have individual combat training rather than formation training. They are faster and more dangerous than the soldiers we faced last night. Vael unfolded her hands from around her teacup and laid them flat on the table. The right hand, the one that had been capped, flexed slightly. 6 exorcists, she said, against 4 people with approximately 12 hours of combined operational experience. I have been doing this for 10 years, he pointed out. 4 people with approximately 10 years and 12 hours of combined operational experience, she amended, with the ghost of that not quite smile at the corner of her mouth. The math is not comfortable, he admitted. But the alternative math is 4 months, 30 to 40 prisoners, and the end of the Grey Country settlements. He let that sit on the table alongside the schematics. Kale pushed off from the wall and came to the table and looked at the Moorgate schematic. She studied it for a while, her yellow-gold eyes moving across the layout with the same focused assessment she had applied to the ridge above Calder's crossing. Then she pointed to a specific section of the schematic. This roof structure, she said. Duret's notes say what it is made of. Timber frame over stone walls. The roof itself is timber. Timber, Kale said, and something in her voice had shifted into a register he had not heard from her before. Something cold and deliberate and very, very focused. Timber I can work with. He looked at her. My sister has been in church custody for 8 days, she said. She did not look up from the schematic. Moorgate is the most likely facility for secondary intake from this region. If she is not there, their records will tell us where she is. He waited. 3 days north and east, she said. Do we have enough supplies? He checked the supply cache numbers in his head. For 3 days of movement with reasonable field rations, yes. Then we are losing daylight, Kale said, and stepped back from the table, and her tail was very still, and her eyes were the color of something that had made a decision. Sera looked at Issei with her dark vertical pupil eyes. He looked at Vael. Vael stood up from the table in one smooth motion and walked to the supply cache flagstone and looked at him with those winter sky eyes and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. He started packing. Chapter 8. The Road to Moorgate. 3 days of movement, and what grew between them. They moved well together. This was the first thing he noted, on the first afternoon of the march north and east, and he noted it in the same way he noted tactical advantages, as a resource to be assessed and utilized rather than a comfort to be enjoyed. The second thing he noted was that they moved well together in ways that were not obvious from their individual capabilities. Kale's range awareness was extraordinary. She tracked movement in a radius of roughly 40 feet without apparent effort, processing information from sound, scent, and the peripheral motion of her tufted ears with an automatic quality that freed her from the conscious scanning that ate his attention. She would tap her ear twice when she sensed something worth attention, once when it resolved as non-threatening. He had not asked her to develop this signal. She had developed it herself, somewhere on the second hour of the first day, as a natural consequence of operating alongside someone who needed the information in a usable form. Sera read terrain. She identified the safest footing through difficult ground, the gaps in visibility that created ambush risk, the water sources and the wind directions and the specific ways that the gray pine forest shaped sound and scent. She described none of this as expertise. She answered questions when asked and volunteered information when she assessed it as relevant, and her assessments were good. Vael was the element he had the least data on, and she remained that way. She moved with a silence that went beyond technique, and had the quality of something trained very deep, deeper than formal instruction. She maintained a position at the rear of the column that covered the approaches he could not watch from the front. She consumed exactly as much of the shared rations as she required and no more, which was less than he would have expected from someone whose frame suggested significant physical capability. She slept in the lightest way he had ever observed in another person, present and functional within 2 seconds of any disturbance. She had, he noted, still not told him anything about her history beyond the facts she had offered at the way station. He did not ask. He had made a practice of not asking people for histories they had not offered, on the grounds that history was a person's own property, and the moment it became a requirement for trust was the moment trust became a transaction. She noticed that he did not ask, on the second day. He noticed that she noticed. "You are not curious," she said during the midday rest on the second day, when Kale was scouting ahead and Sera was treating a blister on her foot with the brisk competence of someone managing a minor logistical problem. "I am curious," he said. "I am also aware that it is not my business." She regarded him. "Most people," she said, "decide that their curiosity makes it their business. Most people are wrong about a lot of things." A pause. She turned the cold, clear attention of her winter sky eyes toward the middle distance, toward the gray pine forest and the pale autumn sky above it. "I was taken by the church 3 weeks ago," she said. "I had been in that particular part of the Grey Country for 5 months, moving through the border settlements, looking for others of my kind." She paused again. "I found some." I was able to warn them before the church patrol found me. They are safe. That matters to you. It is the only thing that matters to me, she said, with a simplicity that was not dramatic and not resigned, but had the quality of something stated as a mathematical fact. He thought about that for a moment. About the vastly patient endurance he had felt when he synced with her through the cell door. About the warmth beneath it that had the frequency of pack loyalty. If we find others along the way, he said, I will not leave them. She looked at him. I know, she said. I have been watching you. You did not leave the last cell. No. Most people would have. I am aware. A silence. The forest moved around them with the light, unhurried movement of midday. I will tell you the rest, she said, when there is time. There is no deadline, he said. She nodded once, a small precise motion, and looked back toward the path where Kale had gone. On the third day, they reached the Moorgate approach and Kale came back from her forward scout with a face that told him something had changed before she spoke a word. There are prisoners in transit, she said. A church convoy for wagons, moving south along the Moorgate access road. They are approximately 3 hours ahead of where we need to be, but they are going to arrive at Moorgate before we can. How many prisoners? I counted at least 12. Possibly more, the wagons are covered. She paused, and her tail moved in the arc that meant she was processing something difficult. Issei. One of the wagons. The second one. Another pause. I heard a voice. He waited. It was Mira, she said. Her voice was level and controlled and completely flat, the way voices went when the person speaking was spending all of their available resources on the control and had nothing left for inflection. I am certain. The forest was very quiet. He looked at the angle of the sun. He looked at the track he had been following in his head for 3 days, the Moorgate access road and its junction with the Highland Path and the distance, and the guard complement of a transit convoy versus a fixed facility. A convoy is more flexible than a fixed facility, he said. The security protocols for transit are designed for movement, not for a targeted extraction. He looked at Kale. Can you reach the second wagon without being seen by the convoy escort? Her pupils were very wide. But her voice was steady. Yes. I will need the escort occupied. If I go through the front of the column, I will take the flank, Sera said, already standing, already moving her balance into field position. Vael said nothing. She looked at the direction of the convoy with the pale gray focus of her eyes and then looked at him, and nodded once. He thought about the math. 8 escort soldiers for a 4-wagon convoy, standard church transit complement. 4 people with 10 years and 12 hours of combined operational experience, as Vael had said, against 8 soldiers on open road with no terrain advantage, and no time for preparation. He thought about Kale's voice when she said I am certain. We move now, he said. Here is the approach. And he laid out the plan in 40 seconds, because 40 seconds was all they had, and they listened with the focused attention of 3 people who had learned, in 3 days of movement together, to trust the information he provided them and filter it through their own capabilities without argument. Then they moved. The gray pine forest closed behind them as they went, and ahead of them the autumn sky was pale and clear, and somewhere on the Moorgate access road a convoy moved south with 12 prisoners and one 11-year-old girl who did not know, yet, that she was about to have company. Chapter 9. The convoy on the Moorgate road. 8 soldiers and 1 very bad hour. He came out of the forest onto the road 50 yards ahead of the lead wagon, moving at a walk, hands visible, posture deliberately non-threatening. This was the opening he had used before in similar situations. Most people's threat assessment started with body language, and body language could be managed. The convoy escort saw him immediately. The 2 outriders at the front of the column held up their right fists, and the column slowed and stopped. Road is clear ahead, he called, making his voice carry the specific quality of someone delivering practical information. 2 church soldiers about a mile north, checking papers. Thought you'd want to know before they see you first. This was not true. But it was the kind of information that created questions in people's minds, and questions slowed decision-making, and slowed decision-making was what he needed for approximately the next 90 seconds. The lead outrider moved forward. Who are you? Traveling merchant. Paper goods and ink, mostly. Not worth stealing. He spread his hands wider. I just thought you should know about the checkpoint. Seemed like the neighborly thing. The outrider was studying him with the professional suspicion of someone whose job was to be professionally suspicious. Behind the outrider, the wagon team was managing the horses with the controlled patience of experienced drivers. The 4 wagons were tightly covered, the canvas lashed down. The outrider opened his mouth to ask a follow-up question. Cale went over the canvas of the second wagon like water going over a rock, fast and fluid and utterly silent. She was there, and then she was inside the covered wagon before the outrider's mouth had finished forming the question. 1 second. 2 seconds. The outrider's eyes were still on Issei. Issei's expression had not changed. Traveling merchant, paper goods, not worth stealing. 3 seconds. Then the second wagon's canvas split along the side seam from inside, a sharp clean cut, and Cale came through the split with a small dark-haired girl pressed against her chest. The girl's eyes were wide and very still, the way eyes went when someone had learned that being still was the safest option. The outrider turned, and Issei moved. He covered the distance in 3 steps and brought the first outrider down with a controlled strike that ended with the soldier sitting in the road looking confused rather than injured, because injured soldiers became motivated soldiers and he needed the next 60 seconds to be about confusion rather than motivation. Sera came out of the tree line on the left side of the column with a focused efficiency that took the second outrider, and the driver of the lead wagon out of the operational picture before the driver had finished registering that there was a problem. Vael was moving along the right side of the convoy, and what she was doing was difficult to track precisely, partly because she was fast and partly because the mode of it had shifted into something that was not quite human in its mechanics, the iron caps gone, the Lobazan heritage no longer suppressed. And the quality of her movement was the quality of something that had been very patient for a very long time, and was no longer required to be. The 8 escort soldiers were down in less than 40 seconds. None of them were dead. He had been specific about this in the plan, and the 3 of them had understood it, and executed accordingly. Church soldiers were doing their jobs as they understood them. They were not, individually, the enemy. The policy was the enemy. The initiative was the enemy. He was aware that this distinction was one not everyone would make, and that it would probably cost him someday, and had decided that the cost was acceptable. The 12 prisoners from the convoy were in various states of distress, all ambulatory, none injured beyond the ordinary damage of 4 days in a covered wagon on a rough road. He gave them 5 minutes. He had learned that 5 minutes, offered immediately after extraction, was the most efficient use of time. It was long enough for people to re-establish basic self-possession, which made the subsequent movement faster and less prone to collapse. Cale and her sister were 10 feet from the convoy, in the shade of the tree line, and he was not watching them, which was the appropriate thing to do. He heard, briefly, a sound that was very young and very relieved and then went quiet. He kept his attention on the convoy and the road. Vael reappeared at his shoulder. She had shifted back to her human-presenting form, and the only indication that anything significant had just occurred was a quality of stillness in her that was slightly deeper than her ordinary stillness. She was breathing with deliberate control. He recognized the pattern. The recalibration after full shift was, he knew from everything he had read, an internal process that took time and care. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. A pause. "It has been 12 days since I shifted. The recalibration is taking longer than I prefer. We have time. The next movement is not for 20 minutes. She looked at him with those gray eyes, and something that had been compressed in them for 12 days had, he noticed, fractionally released. Not warmth exactly, but the absence of the specific cold that captivity put in a thing. "The 12 prisoners," she said. "They cannot go to Moorgate now. No. We will need to establish a new route, and a safe destination." He had been working through this. "There is a settlement called the Greywood, 2 days west. It is off the church's active map for the same reason as the way station. I know the contact. And Moorgate? We continue to Moorgate with or without the convoy interception complicating things." She was quiet for a moment. "We have now intercepted a church convoy in addition to raiding a church facility. The response will be coordinated rather than individual." "Yes. Does that change the plan?" He thought about it honestly. It accelerates the timeline and increases the security we will face at Moorgate. It does not change the necessity of the operation. Vael nodded once. Then we continue. Sera came to stand beside them, her wounds from the convoy engagement freshly addressed, her expression containing the specific focused calm of someone who had found their operational frequency, and was running at it cleanly. The prisoners are ready to move. Where are we taking them? Greywood Settlement. I will guide the group to the head of the Greywood path and leave them with directions and a contact name. The four of us continue north. After Greywood? Moorgate, he said. Cale arrived from the tree line with her sister at her side. The girl, Mira, was small and dark-haired and had her sister's yellow-gold eyes and her sister's set jaw and none of her sister's careful management of her own expression. She was looking at Issei with the direct, assessing attention of a child who had been in danger and come out of it, and was now recalibrating very quickly. You are the Beast Master, Mira said. It was not a question. That is what some people call me, he said. Cale said you can sync with monsters. I can sync with non-human beings. She thought about this. Is Cale a monster? No. Am I? No. She looked at him for another moment. Then she looked at Cale. I like him, she announced. Cale's tail, for the first time since Calder's reach, moved in an arc that was something other than agitation or grief. Just barely. But it moved. Come on, Issei said, and started them moving toward Greywood. Chapter 10, Before Moorgate. The night before the hard part. They left the 12 convoy prisoners at the head of the Greywood path on the afternoon of the third day with a contact name and a note for Hera, the settlement elder, written in a cipher that Hera would recognize and the church would not. They left Mira there too, and this was the longest the column had stopped since the convoy, because Cale did not want to leave and Mira did not want to be left, and the parting required the full measure of the honesty that difficult partings always required. He stood apart from it, and watched the grey pine forest and gave them the time. When Cale came back, she did not speak for a long time. She fell into position on the right flank and her tail was very still and her ears were flat in the way that grief and resolve sometimes looked the same from the outside. They camped 2 miles from the Moorgate perimeter, in a natural hollow between 3 large stones that blocked the wind and limited visibility from outside to less than 10 feet. No fire. Cold rations. He laid out the Moorgate schematic on the flat stone that served as their table, and they went through it by the last light of the autumn sun. The facility was significantly larger than Calder's crossing. The suppression architecture was more complex, with 3 conduit stones instead of 1, arranged in a triangle pattern that made single-point collapse impossible. The security complement included, as Duret's notes had indicated, 6 church exorcists in addition to the garrison soldiers. The exorcists will be the primary problem, he said. They fight as individuals. They do not use formation tactics. This means they are harder to predict and harder to contain. What are their capabilities? Sera asked. Church exorcists at full certification carry 3 standard combat tools. A sanctified blade that is effective against non-human physiology. A ward seal that can suppress a non-human's capabilities temporarily. And the ability to activate suppression sigils on contact, which means that touching certain surfaces inside the facility will be dangerous. That last one is relevant for all 3 of us, Vael said. Yes. I will deal with the sigil active surfaces when I enter. Alone? Again? The suppression field needs to come down first. Until it does, you cannot enter without pain. She looked at him. Something in her expression was not quite argument, but lived adjacent to it. You are efficient, she said, but you are not indestructible. I am aware. He had been thinking about this. There is an alternative approach to the conduit stones. If instead of collapsing them sequentially from inside, I can disrupt the triangulation pattern. He pointed to the schematic. The 3 stones are positioned here, here, and here. If the second stone is disrupted, the triangle loses its geometry. The field does not collapse immediately, but it destabilizes. In a destabilized state, it can be pushed through. It will hurt, but it will not incapacitate. Vael studied the schematic. How long to destabilize the second stone from outside? With me working from inside and someone working from outside simultaneously, approximately 90 seconds. I can withstand 90 seconds of disruption pain, she said. He looked at her. I am Lobizin, she said simply. Pain management is a foundational skill. He thought about the endurance he had felt in the sink through the cell door. About the frequency like granite and deep root systems. All right, he said. The approach changes. I go in first through the same type of gap we found at Calder's crossing. I reach the second conduit stone. Vael takes a position at the exterior wall nearest the stone, at the point I will mark before I enter. When I signal. How do you signal? He thought about it. The listening place. You will feel it, he said. In the same way you felt it in the cell. I will sync and then push. She was quiet for a moment. I have never been synced with before, she said. No. For most people it is not something they are aware of. But you. He paused, working out how to say it accurately. Your heritage gives you a sensitivity to the kind of frequency I work in. You will feel it, I think, more clearly than most. A pause. And you intend to sync through a suppression field. Sync operates on a frequency that suppression architecture is not designed to block. It was built to block active non-human traits. It was not built to block. He searched for the word. Communication. Vael looked at him for a long time. There was something in those pale gray eyes that was considering, carefully, a number of things at once. Then she said, all right. Kale had been sitting on the ground with her back to one of the stones, listening without appearing to listen. I take the roof, she said. It was not a request. Yes. And Sera? Sera takes the loading bay when the field comes down. He looked at Sera. She nodded. She had been checking and rechecking the narrow blade she carried, not from nervousness, he understood, but from the same methodical habit of verification that characterized everything she did. I will need to know where the archive room is. Here. He pointed to the schematic. Second corridor, east side. The archive is the only room with a full wall sigil seal. You will recognize it. And the prisoners? Central block. North wing. He studied the schematic one more time. 30 to 40 people. Moorgate runs a mixed population of holding prisoners and what Direct called reclamation in progress, which means some of them will have been subjected to suppression treatment that may have affected their mobility or clarity. We move everyone we can move and we move them fast. Silence. The wind moved over the stones. 2 miles away, the Moorgate facility sat in the dark, its suppression field active, its 30-odd prisoners waiting through another night. There is one more thing, he said. Duret's notes mention a name. A church official who has been coordinating the reclamation initiative from the command station. His name is Praetor Aldrich Voss. He is not at Moorgate, he operates from the Aldmark Highlands command station, but his authorization codes are on file at Moorgate. Those codes, combined with the archival records, are the documentation component of what I described at the way station. He looked at each of them. If we can retrieve them intact, we can make the initiative visible. Make it a matter of record that cannot be quietly buried. And if it becomes a matter of record? Sera asked. Then the Church has a problem that is political rather than logistical. And political problems, in my experience, require different solutions than logistical ones. Solutions that require the Church to account for itself in ways it is not comfortable with. He folded the schematic and put it away. We move at second hour past midnight, he said. Sleep until then if you can. I will keep watch. He did not say, sleep if you can, because tomorrow is going to be harder than anything we have done yet. He did not need to. They had all read the schematic. They all knew the math. But they had also, in the past 3 days, learned something about what the 4 of them were capable of together. He had been measuring it, adding it up, running the calculations the way he ran all calculations, without sentiment and without self-deception. The numbers were not comfortable. But they were not impossible. He settled his back against the cold stone and watched the autumn stars wheel slowly overhead, and the listening place spread outward into the dark, and 2 miles away the Moorgate facility sat waiting, and somewhere inside it 30 people were still alive, and tomorrow that number was going to get significantly smaller. He breathed. The night deepened. The stars moved. And somewhere in the hollow between the stones, in the space between the cold rations and the worn schematics and the specific silence of people sleeping with tomorrow already in their hands, something that had not existed a week ago had taken shape quietly and without announcement, with the same organic certainty as the roots of the gray pines working into the rock beneath the forest floor. He was not certain, precisely, what to call it yet, but it was there. Act 2, The Moorgate Reckoning. Chapter 11, Second hour past midnight. The weight of what has already been decided. He woke them at the precise hour he had named, not because he had slept and then woken at the right time, but because he had not slept at all and had instead spent 4 hours with his back against cold stone, running the Moorgate schematic through his mind the way a craftsman ran their fingers along the edge of a blade they were about to trust their life to. The schematic had 3 conduit stones. The conduit stones formed a triangle. The triangle's second point was positioned at the east wall of the facility, approximately 18 feet inside the perimeter, in a utility room adjacent to the eastern corridor. He had measured the geometry 4 times in his head and arrived at the same conclusion each time. If he entered through the northwest gap he had identified between the ward stone perimeter columns, he would have approximately 40 seconds of movement through the courtyard to reach the east wall's service entrance before the first rotation patrol completed its circuit. 40 seconds was enough. The service entrance would be locked with a church standard transit seal, heavier than the loading bay locks he had worked at Calder's crossing but built on the same mechanical principles. He had thought about the lock for one of the 4 hours, working through the mechanism in his fingers without touching anything, the way a musician worked through a difficult passage in the silence before performance. The second conduit stone's disruption sequence was the variable he had the least certainty about. He had never disrupted a triangulated suppression field before. He had never synced through an active suppression field either. Both of these things were going to happen in rapid succession at Moorgate, and the honest truth was that he did not know precisely what either of them would feel like from the inside. He had decided that this uncertainty was not a reason to change the plan. It was information. Information that told him to be prepared for the unexpected and to trust, when the unexpected arrived, the same fundamental quality that had been making him useful in dangerous situations for a decade: adaptability. He looked at the 3 of them as they came awake. Sera first, from soldier's sleep, alert within 2 seconds. Kale second, from the lighter rest of the catkin, present before she was fully upright. Vael last, and her waking was the strangest of the 3 because she went from completely still to completely functional with no visible intermediate state, like a switch rather than a dimmer, and her pale gray eyes were clear and oriented immediately. He did not ask if they were ready. He had learned, in the past 3 days, that asking people if they were ready was a form of invitation to doubt themselves, and doubt at this hour served no one. They moved at a walk until the ridge above the Moorgate facility was visible in the dark, and then they separated into their positions without speech, because they had gone over the positions enough times that speech was no longer needed. Kale angled east and up, toward the rooftop approach she had mapped from the ridge in the afternoon. Sera went south, toward the loading bay. Vael positioned at the east wall, at the point he had marked with a scratch on the stone the previous evening when they had done the close reconnaissance. He stood alone at the northwest gap for a moment. The night was cold and clear and the ward stones at the perimeter glowed their slow pale glow, and from inside the facility came the ordinary sounds of a place that believed itself secure. Routine patrol. A door. The distant sound of 2 soldiers talking, words indistinct, the comfortable drone of bored people doing a night shift they had done many times. He breathed. He moved. The northwest gap was narrower than the ridge survey had suggested, which was the first deviation. Church suppression architecture tended to be laid according to a standard spacing that created predictable gaps, but Moorgate's architect had used a slightly wider stone base, which contracted the gap to approximately 14 inches of weakened field rather than the 18 inches he had planned on. He went through at an angle and felt the field brush against him, not painful, just present, a faint pressure that did not belong to physics, and that he had felt before when he worked near suppression architecture. The courtyard was lit by torchlight, for iron brackets, and the positions of the 3 roof sentries were exactly where Kale had reported them. He tracked the patrol shadows on the stone and moved in the rhythm between them, reaching the service entrance in 37 seconds. The lock was heavier than anticipated. He had been right about the upgraded mechanism. He worked through it by touch in the dark, finding the additional tumbler with the patience of someone who had learned that impatience with locks was a transaction where you paid more than you received. It took him 90 seconds, which was 50 more than planned. He filed the deviation and moved on. Inside, the smell of suppression oil and something else, the particular compound smell that he would come to understand better in the minutes ahead. He moved down the eastern corridor with the facility's geography already mapped in his memory, counting doorways, counting junctions, finding the utility room. The door was unlocked. He went in. The second conduit stone sat in its iron cradle and pulsed with its slow cold light, and the sigils on its surface were active and fully charged, and the triangulation made them brighter than a single stone would have been. He pressed his palm against it, and the pain came immediately, sharp and deep, working up through the bones of his hand and wrist. He breathed through it. Found the frequency. And then he reached past the pain toward the listening place and let it expand outward, not in its ordinary omnidirectional spread but in a focus beam, aimed at the east wall, at the 18 feet of stone and courtyard between him and the place where Vael was waiting. The suppression field resisted. This was expected. The field was designed to block non-human frequencies, and the sync ran in a frequency adjacent enough to non-human that the field's architecture recognized it as a potential threat and pushed back. He pressed against the resistance, not forcing it, working around it the way water worked around stone, finding the paths of least opposition. And then Vael pressed back from the other side. He had not known, precisely, how a full Lobazan heritage would respond to a sync attempted through an active suppression field. He had calculated that it was likely that the depth of Lobazan frequency sensitivity made it the closest thing he had encountered to a natural receiver. But calculations about things he had never done before were always provisional. What he had not calculated, and could not have calculated, was the quality of what came back. The Lobazan frequency, fully present and fully focused, was not simply strong. It was structured. It had the specific organized complexity of something that had been thinking about coordination and pact bond and mutual reliance at a deep level for years, long before it had a name or a use. When it pressed back through the suppression field, it did not simply resonate with the sync. It completed it, filling in the harmonics that the sync alone could not produce, turning a signal into a conversation. The second conduit stone destabilized in 67 seconds. The suppression field fractured. From outside the east wall, he heard someone moving through the fracture at speed. Chapter 12, Inside Moorgate. What the treatment did, and what he did about it. The north wing prisoner block was behind a reinforced door with a triple bar lock that took him 3.5 minutes. It was the longest 3.5 minutes he could recall in recent experience, because during those 3.5 minutes the facility was becoming aware that something was wrong. Not aware enough to trigger a full response, but the specific alert quality of an institution that has noticed an anomaly and is waiting to determine its nature. He heard Vael before he saw her. The frequency in the listening place had changed since the sync through the wall, had acquired a clarity and a closeness that was different from proximity alone. It was the particular quality of a frequency that had been opened, the way a room felt different after a window had been raised in it. Warmer without being literally warmer. More present. She appeared at his shoulder from the service entrance corridor without sound. East rooftop sentry contained, she said. Not injured. The west sentry has not moved. Kale is on the roof. A pause during which she assessed the facility's interior with those winter sky eyes. You are bleeding. He looked at his palm. The conduit stone had cracked one of the smaller bones in his hand during the disruption. He had noticed and set it aside because noticing it and addressing it were separate actions. I will manage it when we are out, he said. She looked at his hand for a second longer than was strictly informational, and then looked at the locked door. The triple bar has a central keystone, she said. The other 2 bars are bracing. Remove the keystone and they release. He looked at the lock mechanism. She was right. He had been approaching it as a standard triple bar, which required working all 3 in sequence. A keystone mechanism required accessing the central point first, which was less intuitive but significantly faster. He reached for the central bar and felt for the release. How do you know this? He asked, while his fingers worked. My people have been getting out of things for a long time, she said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite humor and not quite bitterness but that lived exactly between them, the way that very old pains sometimes did when enough time had passed. The door opened. 31 people. He counted them twice in the first 20 seconds, because counting was the first discipline of extraction work, and he had learned not to rely on estimates. 31. 6 unable to stand without assistance. The remainder mobile in varying degrees, from fully functional to the slow, careful movement of someone whose body had been systematically interfered with. The reclamation treatment. He had read Duret's notes on it 3 times, and the reading had not made it smaller. It was an aerosol compound delivered through the facility's ventilation, designed to suppress the biological mechanisms of non-human heritage expression without the immediate pain of wardstone contact. The effect was gradual, sustained, insidious in the specific way of something that moves slowly enough that the person being affected could not precisely identify when they had last felt like themselves. He kept his voice level and his face neutral and gave them the 3 instructions in 20 seconds. Follow Sera's pace, speak if you cannot keep up, the forest is your friend tonight. Then he identified the 3 most functional individuals and gave them the support assignments, and moved toward the administrative center. The first conduit stone was in the administrative center, and the administrative center had 2 exorcists. He dealt with the first one through the standard approach, redirecting forward pressure into a controlled conclusion. The first one was young and trained and entirely certain that the situation matched his training scenarios, which it did not, and that certainty was the structural weakness he exploited. The second exorcist was older and more patient, and fought with the economy of someone who had been in enough real engagements to know the value of waiting for the opponent's mistake. He did not rush. He circled. He used the room's geometry to limit options, which was tactically sound. He also reached for the ward seal at his belt, which was the moment things changed. A ward seal pressed against Vael's skin would suppress her capabilities for 40 minutes. The engagement was currently going in a direction that did not require Vael to be fully operational, but 40 minutes of suppression represented a significant tactical liability for everything that came after, and the exorcist was 4 steps from the corridor where Vael was managing the 2 soldiers who had come from the west wing. He synced. Not the light touch he used for quick situations. The full sync, the costly one, the one that required him to be open in a way he was never entirely comfortable being. He pressed the full force of the listening place against the exorcist's frequency, and let him feel what was true. The north wing and what he would have found there if he had gone through that door 30 seconds earlier. The 6 people in Calder's Crossing who had lived in a settlement for 3 years and worked their land and paid their taxes and had done nothing to invite what happened to them. Vael in the last cell with the iron caps on her hands and 12 days of patient endurance. Kale's sister on the convoy wagon at 11 years old. It was not an argument. Arguments could be countered. This was simply the truth, transmitted at a depth that bypassed the institutional reasoning that had built the exorcist's worldview and found the human frequency underneath it, and the human frequency underneath it knew, on a level that did not require deliberation, that what it had been participating in was not right. The exorcist stood still. His hand dropped from the ward's seal. Something moved through his face that Issei had seen before, in the young exorcist at the courtyard and in other people at other moments over the years. The specific expression of someone who has just found themselves on the wrong side of a line they thought they knew the location of. He collapsed the first conduit stone. The suppression field died. He left the exorcist in the administrative center, standing with his hand at his side, and went back to the north wing. The prisoner block was already in motion when he returned. Torval, whose Ursine heritage had re-engaged the moment the suppression field dropped, was carrying 2 of the least mobile prisoners with a steady competence that required no direction. Breek had taken a 3rd. The others moved in the column formation he had described, Sera already at the loading bay door, holding the threshold. He counted as they went through, 23, 24, 25. The column moved. Then the push came from the main entrance. He had been expecting it. The consolidated force, 12 soldiers and the remaining exorcists, had been regrouping since the suppression field dropped, because trained garrison troops did not simply accept a facility breach. They adapted, they consolidated, and then they pushed. The timing was exactly what he would have done in their position. He turned back. Kale dropped from the interior ceiling at the corridor junction with the specific quality of motion that her full catkin capability produced, gravity treated as a suggestion rather than a rule. She hit the floor mid-stride and did not stop, flowing into the engagement from above and at an angle that no training manual addressed because training manuals were written by people who did not fully account for the vertical dimension. Vael came through the south corridor door. She had shifted. Not fully, not the way she had on the convoy road, but enough. The Lobazan heritage was present in her movement in a way that was difficult to describe precisely and impossible to misidentify. She moved like something that had its own gravity, like something that had been restrained for a very long time and was no longer restrained, and the specific quality of that movement was something he had never encountered before and would not forget. He dealt with his sector, 3 exorcists, his portion of the consolidated force, and the mathematics of the engagement required that he not watch what Kale and Vael were doing, because watching was the one luxury that multi-person engagements did not offer. He trusted the listening place to track the rough shape and trusted them to do what they had demonstrated, in 3 days and 2 operations, that they could do. He put his 3 down in the order that tactical logic dictated. The last of the consolidated force, a soldier who had not entered the fight but had been holding the main entrance as a fallback, made the practical decision to move before the engagement resolved. He let him go. Operational necessity, not mercy, but the two were not incompatible. Loading bay, he said. They went. Chapter 13, The Forest After Moorgate. What 31 people looked like moving through the dark. Moving 31 people through the grey pine forest at night was not elegant, and was not planned and had to be improvised from available resources, which was the definition of most operations that had passed through the planning stage and entered the real world. He put Torval at the rear, Sera at the front, Kale on alternating flanks. He told Vael to go where her judgment said she was most useful, because in 3 days he had learned that her judgment about this was better than his. The column moved. He called the pace from the center, adjusting it to the least mobile member rather than the most capable, because a column that fractured was a worse outcome than a column that moved slowly. He had learned this from an operation 4 years ago that had taught him several things he would have preferred to learn differently. The terrain was reasonable for the first 2 miles. Then the forest thinned and the ground dropped into a boggy section that required careful stepping, and the careful stepping meant the pace dropped to something that made him calculate the church's response timeline with increasing attention. He had 20 minutes before Moorgate's alert riders would be on the road. The riders would take the road, not the forest, which gave the column a structural advantage. Roads were faster for horses. Forests were faster for small groups moving on foot who knew what they were doing. At the 4-hour mark they reached the secondary way station in the eastern foothills. He opened the supply cache and distributed without ceremony. 31 people who had not had a full meal in several days received food, and the sound of that was one of the more uncomplicated sounds he had heard in recent days, which was saying something because recent days had contained the sound of people being freed. He sat on the cache stone and let them settle. Torval found him before dawn, moving with the deliberate quiet of his heritage, and sat on the stone across from him and told him about the secondary block. 6 cells. Deeper in the facility. The exorcists called it the secondary block. Torval had heard them through the ventilation for 6 weeks, voices and the sound of a different kind of door, heavier, with a different acoustic quality from the north wing doors. Voices that were not quite right, not the voices of the simply frightened or simply suppressed, but something with a different quality that he had not been able to name in 6 weeks of listening. He had not gone in. He had not known about a secondary block. Duret's schematic had not shown one. Either it was added after Duret left service or someone had deliberately omitted it from the plans she had copied, which implied a level of counterintelligence within the church that he had not previously accounted for. He thanked Torval and sat with it for the remainder of the dark hours, adding it to the structure of what he knew and what he did not know and what the gap between those 2 things implied. He wrote 3 messages in the first gray light of morning. One to Hera at Greywood, outlining the group's size and the supply situation. one to his contact in the southwestern Grey Country with Torval's family information, one to Lyra, his long-cultivated source in the Grey territory between the second and third facilities, asking for current intelligence on the Saltmarsh station and anything she could determine about the secondary block's occupants. He gave the messages to Cale, who had proven reliable, and watched him disappear into the Grey Pine Forest with the focused purposefulness of someone who had found their role and was executing it. Then he sat at the way station entrance and watched the morning come. Sera found him there. She sat beside him, and for a while they watched the light move across the Grey Pine canopy in the way morning light moved through those specific trees, through the needles and the gray-green trunks and the particular quality of autumn dawn that was not quite gold, and not quite silver but somewhere in between. She told him about the documents, not just the authorization codes. The full scope of what she had seen in the archive room in the 40 seconds she had been working through the document cases. The 11 collection points. The heritage assessment officers embedded in Grey Country settlements, doing what looked like administrative routine. The monthly updated list. The ratings and assessments and family connections and heritage degree notations that constituted, in aggregate, a complete operational map of every non-human heritage individual in the Church's jurisdictional reach. He listened without expression. He let it settle into the structure of his understanding, the way significant information settled, not with drama but with the quiet finality of a stone being placed where it would stay. Lists, he said. Lists, she said. They watched the morning for a while. There is someone in the northern provinces, he said. A former church administrator named Wren. She was senior administrative staff for 22 years. She left 3 years ago. I have been keeping her as a contact resource in the event that I reached a point where administrative network access became necessary. He paused. That point is now. Sera looked at him. You have been building this for a long time. Yes. Alone. He said nothing. That must have been. She paused, choosing her word. Difficult. He thought about the 11 months since Duret's death. The 3 years before that of building contacts and collecting information and running the occasional small operation, always alone, always with the particular quality of efficiency that was the efficiency of someone who had no one to consult about alternatives. The specific weight of a plan that only existed inside one person's head. Yes, he said. It was. She nodded once. She did not offer comfort, which he appreciated, because comfort was not what the moment required. She simply acknowledged the truth of it and let it be true, which was its own form of courtesy. What do you need me to do? She said. He told her. Chapter 14. Vael and Breek. What people with practical skills do when given a purpose. Breek found him mid-morning. She was compact and dense with the Ursine heritage concentrated in the way she occupied space, and she had 11 years of settlement border patrol behind her, and the specific quality of someone who processed new information by measuring it against a large internal database of things that had and had not worked in difficult terrain. She sat down without preamble, and told him she had overheard his conversation with Cale about the valley. He did not apologize for the conversation being overheard. She had Ursine hearing, and he had been talking at a normal volume in an open space. The responsibility for that was his. What do you think of it? He asked. She gave it the consideration it deserved, which was a few seconds of genuine assessment rather than an immediate answer. I think a fixed settlement in an unmapped valley is a better long-term outcome than the Grey Country's current situation, which is movement and hope and the kindness of Harras who have 12 empty shelters. She looked at her hands, broad and careful. I think 11 years of border patrol is exactly the skill set a new settlement needs in its first year, before the walls are solid and the routes are mapped. Belmore, he said. Belmore is 6 weeks gone from me, she said. I do not know its current state. I know Torval's family is there, and I know that the garrison commander who took Torval was not the pragmatic kind. A pause. What I know about Belmore is that it was built by good people using good judgment, and good judgment said cooperate and be visible, and good judgment was wrong. Another pause, longer. Sometimes good judgment is wrong. That does not mean it was not good judgment. It means the situation changed around it. He looked at her. I am not making an offer, she said, for the second time. Not until I know Torval's family is safe, and not until I know more about this valley. But I am here. For now. And I have skills. I know you have skills, he said. I have been watching you work since the forest. Something shifted in her expression. Not surprise. But the small involuntary motion of someone whose competence has been accurately seen by someone capable of seeing it accurately. What do you need? She asked. Help managing the group through to Greywood. The march logistics, the pace setting, the field decisions that Torval is handling at the rear and that I need handled at the center as well. Done, she said, and stood up, and went to find the center of the group. Hera met them at Greywood's northern edge with the equanimity of someone who had received Issei's message and had spent the intervening time converting surprise into practical response. 50 people, she said, looking at the group. 51 including me, Sera said, from beside Issei. Hera looked at Sera with the attention of someone who was storing information for later use. You wrote the message, she said. Not him. He described what was needed. I translated it into terms that would travel the contact chain accurately. Good translation, Hera said, and meant it. She looked back at Issei. 12 empty shelters. 40% of the stores I need for this group for 30 days. He told her about the authorization codes and the church supply depots at the abandoned facilities. She looked at the codes. She looked at the 50 people behind him. She looked back at the codes. Redirecting abandoned church supplies to house the people the church displaced from those facilities, she said, very precisely. Yes, he said. She thought about it for approximately 4 seconds. I will need someone who knows the church administrative filing system, she said. He looked at Sera. Sera had already taken the codes from his hand. The supply requisition took Sera 4 hours. Hera watched throughout, learning, making occasional notes in a small book she carried in her coat pocket. When it was done, she looked at Sera with the specific quality of respect that practical expertise inspired in people who dealt in practical expertise. Church administrative school, Sera said before Hera could ask. Starting at age 3. A pause. That must have been a complicated education, Hera said. Yes. Hera reached out and pressed her hand briefly to Sera's arm, in the gesture of one woman to another that carried more than words generally managed. Sera looked at the gesture and then looked at the gray pine forest beyond the settlement's edge, and neither of them spoke for a moment, and neither of them needed to. Issei was standing far enough away to observe without intruding, and what he observed was 2 people recognizing something in each other that had come from the same large and complicated institution and had managed, by different routes and at different costs, to arrive somewhere outside it. He turned away and gave them the space. Chapter 15, The Valley. What he had been keeping to himself for 2 years. He described it to them the morning after Greywood, when they were back in the forest and moving north and east, and the settlement was a day behind them and the Aldmark Highlands were 4 days ahead. He described it factually, in the way he described most things. No advocacy. No persuasive framing. Just the dimensions and the geography and the practical assessment of viability. 2 days past the Highland Way station. A valley 3 miles long and 1 mile at its widest, oriented east-west so the longest axis caught the morning light, and the ridges on the north and south sides provided wind shelter. A stream that ran the full length, fed by snow melt from the northern ridge, reliable year-round based on the 2 years he had watched it. Alluvial soil along the stream's eastern half that was workable for root crops and grain. Stands of pine and hardwood on the valley sides that provided building material. He described the access routes, 2 points where the ridge walls could be crossed on foot, both narrow enough to be defensible, both obscured enough from the outside to be easily missed by anyone who was not specifically looking. He described the absence of church mapping in that area, which he had verified through Duret's administrative contacts 2 years ago when he had first surveyed the valley and begun to hold it in his mind as a possibility. He described, plainly, what it would require to establish a viable settlement there. 30 adults minimum, 60 preferred in the first year. A construction phase of 3 months before winter made shelter work impractical. Supply lines to Greywood and the Grey Country network until first harvest. A defensive perimeter that worked with the natural terrain rather than against it. When he was done, they walked in silence for a while. Cale said, "You have been carrying this for 2 years. Yes. Alone. Yes." She said nothing for a while. Her tail moved in a slow arc. Mira would grow up there, she said. Not a question. If you chose that, he said carefully. If we built it, she said. He looked at her. It is not your valley, she said. She said it without heat, with the matter-of-fact quality of someone stating a principle that seemed important to get right. You surveyed it. You planned it. But it does not belong to you. It belongs to the people who live in it. Yes, he said. I know that. She looked at him with those yellow-gold eyes for a moment. Good, she said, and moved back to her flank position. Sera had been walking beside him during the exchange. She said, I can draft a shelter construction plan. I observed Greywood's architecture during the 3 days there. I know what worked and what did not, what the timber frame joints looked like after 3 years of highland weather, what the insulation gaps were. If you give me the valley dimensions and the available materials, I will describe the valley in detail tonight, he said. I know, she said. I am already thinking about the materials list. He looked at her. I was educated to plan and administer, she said. I have never had anything worth planning for. A pause that was brief and not complicated. Now I do. He said nothing. There was nothing useful to say. They walked north and east through the gray pine forest, and the listening place moved through the ambient frequencies of the living world around them, and the valley existed somewhere ahead, real and unmapped and waiting, and the distance to it shortened with every step. Chapter 16, Third Night. What costs what around a small fire? They made a fire that night in a hollow between 2 large stones, small and efficient and minimally smoky, and Kale produced rabbits that she did not announce, and Sera cooked them with the brisk competence of someone who approached cooking the same way she approached lox, a system with specific inputs and predictable outputs if you understood the mechanism. They ate, and the fire burned, and for a while no one spoke, and the silence had the quality of comfortable silence rather than tense silence, which was, he had noted, a relatively recent development in their collective dynamic. Vael broke it. Tell me about the sink, she said. She was looking at the fire. What it costs. The deep version. At Moorgate, with the exorcist at the end. He looked at her. I could feel it from the courtyard, she said. The quality of it was different from the wall sink. It was. She searched for the word with the precision she brought to all word choices. Heavier. Not louder. Heavier. The deep sink is expensive in a way that is hard to quantify, he said. It requires me to be fully present in a way that I am not always comfortable being. The ordinary sink is an opening. The deep sink is. He stopped and tried again. I am not naturally an open person. The deep sink requires me to be open past the point where I control what is exchanged. What I show is true, but what comes back is also true, and sometimes what comes back is not what I was prepared to receive. What came back from the exorcist? She asked. He thought about it. The answer was private in a way that most things were not private to him, because most things were tactical and tactical things could be discussed. This was not tactical. Youth, he said finally. He was 23, approximately. He had been in church service since he was 14. 9 years of being told that his purpose was to protect people, that what he was doing was protection, and he had believed it, not because he was simple or without intelligence but because he had been in an institution since adolescence and institutions shaped what seemed true. He paused. What came back was someone who had never been given the chance to know differently. And I showed him differently, and what came back from that was... He stopped again. Grief, Vael said. Yes. For the things he had participated in. Yes. A silence. The fire shifted. A log settled. That stays with you, she said. It was not a question. Yes. Every time you sink deeply, every person is different. Some of them are. He looked for the word. Simpler. The frequency is less complex. What comes back is fear, or loyalty to the institution, or just the ordinary human resistance to disruption. Those do not stay. The ones with real depth. The ones where there is something genuinely worth knowing about. He paused. Those stay. Vael was quiet for a long time. The fire burned between them. He looked at the fire and not at her, because what he had just said was more than he generally said about himself, and he was calibrating whether he had made an error. The wall sink, she said. You showed me something that was not grief. No. What did you show me? Recognition, he said. The same thing I show every being I sync with. What is already there? In your case, the specific frequency that was already there was the lobazin pact bond instinct. I recognized it and let you feel that recognition. And what came back, she said? Carefully. From that, he thought about what had come back through the east wall of the Moorgate facility, through an active suppression field, in the 67 seconds before the conduit stone destabilized. The quality of it. The specific character of what the lobazin frequency felt like when it was fully present and fully focused and choosing to be in contact. Steadiness, he said. The specific kind of steadiness that comes from a very long time of knowing exactly who you are and what you are for. She was quiet for a while. Then, no one has described me that way before. Most people cannot perceive that frequency without the sync, he said. No. A pause. But some people can sense things without the sync. Approximately. And the ones who can. She stopped. He waited. The ones who can, she said, have tended to find that frequency frightening rather than steady. He thought about this. About full lobazin heritage, and what it looked like to the outside world, through the lens of church doctrine and the accumulated fear that doctrine produced. About Vael in the last cell, 12 days of captivity, and the specific quality of her expression when he had said, I am going to remove the chains, if you are willing. It is not frightening, he said. She looked at him. The firelight moved across her pale features, across the winter sky eyes that carried everything they carried and showed very little of it. And what showed now was something that was not quite relief and was not quite recognition but was the specific compound of both that happened when a thing you had known to be true about yourself but had never heard confirmed aloud was confirmed aloud. No, she said. I know. Kale, on the other side of the fire, had her chin on her knees and her ears turned toward them. Sera had put down the blade she had been sharpening. Either of them spoke. He looked back at the fire. The fire was doing what fires did. It asked no questions. It produced light and heat and the specific quality of a small enclosed warmth that had no tactical value and a great deal of some other value, the kind that did not have a clear operational name but that he had noticed, over years of working alone, was the thing he had the most difficulty replacing when it was absent. He would not have named what the four of them had built in the past week and a half. He did not have good words for it, and did not feel the need to supply bad ones. But it was there. He banked the fire and took first watch. Chapter 17, Lyra's Message. Information at a price and a timeline that changed everything. Lyra's response came on the 7th day of the march north and east, delivered by a woman who appeared from the grey pine forest with a completeness and suddenness that surprised even Kale's peripheral awareness, which was not easily surprised. She handed him the message without words and was gone before any of them fully registered she had been there. He decoded it on the move, reading the cipher in his head the way he read most things, without needing to stop. He decoded it, and read it twice, and then looked at the forest canopy for a moment, and then called the others close. 3 pieces, he said. He kept his voice level. The Saltmarsh Station security has been doubled since Moorgate. Church-wide elevated alert. 12 exorcists and 40 garrison soldiers. A silence. 40, Kale said. And 12 exorcists. He continued. Second, the Moorgate secondary block was real. Lyra has confirmation from a church supply system contact. 6 individuals in deep suppression, held in the secondary block. The nature of deep suppression is not fully described, but it is distinct from standard ward-stone suppression. Her contact used the phrase sustained state study, which I am interpreting as I read it and not adding to. Vael did not change expression. Something in her frequency in the listening place changed. Not dramatically. But the quality of her stillness shifted, became the stillness of someone who has heard something they had been half knowing for a long time and have just received the other half. Third, he said. Ren. Lyra knows her. She is not in the northern provinces. She is in the Altmark Highlands, 3 days from the Saltmarsh Station. He paused. The full text of Lyra's statement is, she has been waiting for you. He folded the message. 3 years, Sera said. She has been waiting 3 years? Apparently. For what? That, he said, is the question I intend to ask her. They made camp that night with the changed arithmetic sitting in the middle of them like an uninvited guest, present whether acknowledged or not. 40 soldiers and 12 exorcists was not a fight. It was not even a problem solvable by cleverness, because cleverness had physical limits and 40 trained soldiers exceeded them. He thought about it for a long time while the others slept. He thought about Saltmarsh's age. 30 years of operation meant 30 years of suppression architecture aging in ways that routine maintenance did not fully address. Duret's survey was 18 years old. 18 years of field drift and minor misalignments accumulating in a system that the Church had been upgrading rather than replacing, which meant the suppression architecture was a palimpsest, new sigils over old foundations, and palimpsest had discontinuities where the layers did not fully merge. He thought about where 40 soldiers came from. The Church did not have unlimited garrison resources. Concentrating 40 at Saltmarsh meant drawing from the other facilities. Concentrating on Saltmarsh meant accepting exposure elsewhere. There was a pattern there, a vulnerability, if he could determine what it implied about the distribution of the Church's remaining operational capacity. He thought about the 6 individuals in deep suppression and what sustained state study meant, and what kind of institution would use that phrase, and what kind of person would design a program that used that phrase, and what Wren, with 3 years of watching from the Aldmark Highlands, might know about that person. He thought about the valley, and then he thought about something else. About the 50 people at Greywood and the network those 50 people represented. About Torval and Breek and their skills. About Lyra's network and its people. About the Grey Country settlements and their informal communication systems, the ways information moved between them through travelers and traders and the occasional deliberate courier. About what it would mean to not fight 40 soldiers head-on. About what it would mean to make the head-on fight unnecessary. The plan changed. Not its goals. Its method. At the second hour, he woke them. He laid it out over an hour while the fire burned low. Not a direct assault on Saltmarsh. Something else. Something that used the Grey Country network's existing capacity rather than trying to replace it with 4 people, and that addressed the Saltmarsh problem not as a military operation but as a coordination problem. The settlement communities in the Grey Country had been moving in isolation because isolation was the strategy that had seemed safest. But isolation was also the vulnerability that made them easy to pick off one at a time, which was exactly what the Reclamation Initiative had been doing for 3 years. If the isolation was replaced with coordination, if the communities could act simultaneously rather than sequentially, then the Church's response capacity, which was already stretched by the Saltmarsh concentration, would face a problem at more points than it could address at once. He was not building an army. He did not want an army. What he wanted was an event, distributed and simultaneous, across enough points that the Church's response was fragmented rather than focused. The kind of event where each individual component was small enough to be plausibly deniable as coincidence, and the aggregate was large enough to be impossible to ignore. Wren was the key. If her credentials still had any access to the Church's administrative network, she could use the authorization codes to identify and warn the collection point targets on the heritage assessment list. Warned communities could move before the initiative's end of window operation reached them. Communities that moved simultaneously, on a scale the Church could not quietly manage, became a political problem rather than a logistical one. And a political problem required a different kind of response, one that moved through institutions rather than around them, one that was slow and required accountability. And accountability was the one thing the Reclamation Initiative had been designed to avoid. Saltmarsh is still necessary, he said. The 6 individuals in deep suppression, the central archive, the authorization code access point. But we do not need to assault it. We need to enter it at the right moment. The right moment being? Sera asked. When its 40 soldiers are occupied with something else, he said. A pause. You intend to create a diversion of sufficient scale to draw 40 trained soldiers away from a high-security facility, Cale said. Yes. Using the Grey Country network. Yes. Which you will coordinate through Wren, who has been waiting for you in the Aldmark Highlands for 3 years, with 3 years of collected intelligence and potentially active Church administrative credentials. Yes. She looked at him. When were you going to tell us that you had been building toward this specific moment for considerably longer than 3 days? I told you in the way station, he said. I said there was a plan. You said there was a plan against the reclamation initiative. You did not say the plan was this. The plan was not this until tonight. She stared at him. The plan is a living thing, he said. It grows from what we find. What we found at Moorgate, and what Lyra sent changed its shape. This is the shape it has now. Another pause. Then she looked at Vael. Vael was looking at him with those pale gray eyes, and what was in them was complex and attentive, and something that was not quite the absence of surprise but was very close to it. You adapt, she said? Yes. Rapidly, when necessary. She looked at the fire for a moment. The 6 in deep suppression. The transfer to Aldmark is in 11 days. He had checked this against the timeline. Yes. Then we have 11 days to reach Ren, activate the network, create the diversion, and enter Saltmarsh. We have 11 days before the transfer. If the transfer completes, the 6 are inside Voss's research facility at Aldmark and the complexity of extracting them increases by an order of magnitude. 11 days, she said. And then she said nothing else, but her expression had the quality of someone who has sealed a decision and is now engaged in the work of the decision rather than the deliberation. Cale looked at Sera. Sera looked at Cale. Something passed between them that did not require words. The specific communication of two people who had, in the past week and a half, developed the shorthand of genuine operational partnership. 11 days, Cale said. We move at first light. We move now, he said. First light is 2 hours away. They moved. Chapter 18. The Aldmark Approach. Patrol evasion and what it teaches you about patience. The Aldmark Highlands were, from a purely geographical standpoint, beautiful. He was aware of this in the same way he was aware of most things that were not immediately tactically relevant, noted, filed, available for retrieval at a time when it might matter. The exposed ridge country, the stone formations weathered by wind into shapes that no human hand could have planned, the quality of light at altitude that had a clarity and a coldness that was unlike the light at lower elevations, all of these were true and present, and he appreciated them in the background of his attention, while the foreground of his attention was occupied with the patrol they had been avoiding for the past day and a half. 6 riders on the Ridge Road. Church standard patrol configuration, moving in a pattern designed to cover maximum ground with minimum personnel. He had identified the pattern on the first afternoon, and had since been navigating around it the way you navigated around a predictable obstacle, not by removing it but by understanding it well enough to know where it would be at any given time. Cale had been running interference at the forward edge of their travel, her range awareness providing advance warning of the patrol's position changes that was, in practice, better than any other intelligence source available. She communicated through the signal system she had developed, 2 ear taps for attention, 1 for all clear, a raised fist copy from the gesture he used. It was efficient, and it had evolved naturally over 11 days of operation, which told him something about her that she had not described in words. On the afternoon of the second Highland day, the patrol changed its pattern. Cale came back from the forward edge and said, 6 became 10. 4 riders joined from the east. They are moving differently. Not a coverage pattern. A search pattern. He thought about what had changed. The most likely answer was that their trail had been picked up somewhere in the lower foothills, which meant the church's response to Moorgate and the convoy interception had reached the Highlands faster than his timeline had anticipated. Which was, in turn, information about the scope of the response, not a local garrison reaction but something coordinated from a higher level. Voss, Vael said. She had been listening from 2 paces back. Yes. The elevated response coordination is consistent with command-level authorization. He looked at the ridge ahead. He knows someone is operating in this region. He does not know who or precisely where. But he is narrowing. How long before he narrows enough? In the open highland, 3 days. In the forest below the ridge, considerably longer. He made the decision in the time it took to make it. We go below the ridge. It adds half a day. Half a day we do not have, Cale said. Half a day is better than the alternative, he said. She did not argue. She turned and led them toward the tree line below the ridge road, moving with the economy of motion that characterized her fully operational mode. The half-day was difficult terrain, scrambling through a mix of highland scrub and loose stone that required attention at every step. The wind came without courtesy from the north, and the exposure was significant, and the footing was the kind that told you very specifically what your body was doing, and how long it had been doing it. On the scramble section above the tree line, Vael fell, not dramatically. A single misstep on a loose stone, the kind that happened to everyone working difficult terrain, and the recovery was immediate, and she was up before he had fully registered the motion. But she was carrying more than she had been carrying since Moorgate. The recalibration from the shift on the convoy road combined with the deep suppression residue from 12 days in church captivity, and the fall had a quality that the listening place registered as fatigue deeper than the surface level. He did not address it immediately. That was not the moment, but when they reached the tree line and the footing stabilized, he came up beside her and said quietly, "How are you?" Not a question with a question mark. A question with a period. The kind that invited an honest answer rather than a performative one. She looked at the trees for a moment. "The recalibration from the convoy shift is taking longer than it should," she said. "The suppression residue from the captivity is interfering with the process. It will resolve, but it is taking more time than I would prefer. Is there anything that helps it?" A pause. "Rest. And..." She stopped. "And the pack bond," she said. For Lobazin, the recalibration from a difficult shift is historically performed within the pack. The frequency proximity of the pack accelerates the process. Another pause. "I have not had a pack in 3 years. I have been recalibrating alone for 3 years, and it takes longer alone, but it does complete." He thought about the listening place, and what it could do, and whether what it could do was the same as the pack bond she was describing or only adjacent to it. "Tonight," he said. "When we camp. Tell me what it would require." She looked at him with those winter sky eyes, and there was something in them that was careful and old, and had been alone with itself for a very long time. "You cannot replicate a pack," she said. "No. But the sync operates in the pack bond's frequency. It is not the same thing. It may not be equivalent. But it may be close enough to be useful." She was quiet for a long time. The tree line moved around them, the pines close and sheltering after the exposed ridge. "All right," she said. They kept moving. That night he tried it. He asked Cale and Sera to give him and Vael space, without explaining precisely why, and Cale looked at him with the comprehensive assessment of those yellow-gold eyes and said nothing, and Sera very carefully did not look at either of them as they moved to the other side of the fire. He sat facing Vael in the way he sat for the deep sink, back straight, hands rested open on his knees, the listening place fully extended and receptive. "Tell me what the frequency feels like," he said. "When it is working correctly. When the recalibration is happening as it should." She thought about how to describe it. "Like roots," she said. "The way a tree's roots move through the ground, not in a direction but in all directions, finding and being found. Everything oriented outward and inward at the same time. I am going to reach for that frequency," he said. "I will not lead it. I will follow it. When you feel the sync, hold the description in your mind and let it be the frequency. And if it does not work, then it does not work, and we know that." She looked at him for a moment with those winter sky eyes. Then she closed them. He reached. The Lobazin frequency was immediately present, and immediately complex, more complex at this range and in this quality of attention than it had been through the suppression field, more layered, more structured. The roots metaphor was accurate. He felt the outward and inward orientation of it, the simultaneous reach in all directions that was the pack bond's fundamental architecture, and he followed it rather than leading it, letting it move where it moved and coming alongside. Something shifted. He could not have said precisely what. The frequency did not change. The sync did not produce anything visible or audible or measurable by any standard he had for measurement. But the quality of the frequency changed in the way that a sound changed when a second harmonic was introduced alongside it, becoming richer, more resonant, more fully itself. He sat with it for a long time. When he opened his eyes, the fire had burned significantly lower. He looked at Vael. She had her eyes open and she was looking at the fire, and her expression had a quality that he had not seen on it before, a quality of release that was not vulnerability and not weakness but the specific release of something that had been held for a long time and was, for the moment, no longer required to be held. Yes, she said quietly. That is close enough. He did not say anything. He did not look away. The fire burned. The highland night was very cold and very clear, and the stars were extraordinary at this altitude, and none of the circumstances that had brought them here were simple or comfortable, and all of them were, in the way of things that were true, precisely what they were. Chapter 19 Wren. What 3 years of waiting looks like when you find it. Wren's house sat in a fold of highland valley where the wind was partially blocked by the ridge behind it, with a spring 40 feet from the door and a turf roof that had been maintained with the care of someone who intended to be there for a long time. It was built into the hillside in the low, unremarkable style that made it look more geological than architectural. Someone had chosen the location with exceptional care. She opened the door before he knocked. She was standing in the doorway with the calm of someone who had heard them on the approach long before they arrived, which meant either Lyra's network had given her notice or she had her own early warning system, and from what he knew of Wren, both were plausible. She was approximately 55, with white hair worn close and dark eyes that had the quality of someone who had spent a long time at institutional altitude and had come down, and was now engaged in the deliberate project of becoming a person rather than a function. She wore plain wool clothing, practical. She looked at him, and then she looked at the 3 people behind him, and something moved through her expression, not surprise, the satisfaction of a prediction confirmed. You took your time, she said. I was not ready before, he said. She looked at him for a moment. I know, she said. Come in. I have been collecting things. Inside was the inside of a place organized for long-term serious occupation. Shelves covering 3 walls, holding books and copied documents, and sealed cases and labeled containers. A fire maintained with professional efficiency. A table large enough for 5 cleared. She made tea without asking. He watched her move through the space with the particular economy of someone who had made all the unnecessary motions long ago and had stopped making them. Every action produced its outcome cleanly. She sat and looked at him and said, How much do you know? He told her. The 5 facilities, the 11 collection points, the heritage assessment list, the authorization codes, Duret's files, Pretervas, the secondary block, the 6 in deep suppression, and the 11-day transfer window. She listened without interrupting. Her expression did not change in ways that were visible, but the quality of her attention shifted as he spoke, becoming the attention of someone checking what they were hearing against a very large internal database, and finding the match percentage satisfactory. You do not know about the 6th facility, she said, when he finished. He looked at her. The Altmark command station has lower levels, she said. Not a containment facility. A research facility. Voss was a researcher before he was an administrator. The initiative has 2 purposes that have always been in operation simultaneously. The visible purpose is the reduction of the non-human heritage population in the Grey Country. The invisible purpose is Voss's actual project. She paused. He waited. He wants to understand the mechanics of non-human heritage, she said. How it is encoded. How it is transmitted. How it might be. She chose the next word with the precision of someone who had thought carefully about precision. Redirected. He has been working on this question for 30 years. The Reclamation Initiative is partly his funding mechanism and partly his sample collection system. The fire was very quiet. The 6 in the secondary block at Moorgate, Vael said. Her voice was level and careful. Sustained state study. They were not held for containment. No, Wren said. They were held because Voss had completed the preliminary phase on them and was waiting for transfer to Altmark. The deep suppression maintains their heritage mechanisms in a specific state that allows detailed study without degradation of the heritage signature. She looked at Vael directly. Without the subject's awareness, and without consent, Kael's ears went flat. Sera set down her teacup. They are still alive, he said. For weeks ago, yes. I have a contact in the Altmark maintenance system who updates me monthly. She looked at him steadily. The transfer is scheduled for the end of this month. 11 days. I know, he said. Then you know that if the transfer completes, Voss has them inside a facility that makes your 5-facility problem look simple. Yes. She looked at him for a moment, and then she looked at all of them, and what she looked like was someone who had been carrying a very heavy thing alone for 3 years and had just seen 4 people capable of helping carry it. My credentials, she said. I left 3 years ago under terms that included a standard administrative separation protocol. My credentials were formally deactivated. However, she paused. 22 years of senior administrative service gives you a particular kind of knowledge. You know where the formal systems end and the informal ones begin. You know the back channels and the discretionary access points and the emergency override protocols that were put in place before the formal credential system existed and that were never fully integrated into it. Another pause. I have not tested whether those pathways are still functional. But I have reason to believe they are. The Heritage Assessment Database, he said. Yes. If the emergency override pathways are still active, I can access the database through a route that bypasses the formal credential verification. I can identify every collection point officer in every Grey Country settlement. I can send warning to every settlement elder on the list. How long would the warning take to reach them? Through the church's internal communication network, which moves faster than courier. 2 days for the settlements within 100 miles of the network relay points. Longer for the more remote settlements. 2 days, he said. He was calculating. If the warnings go out at the same time we move on Saltmarsh, the church faces simultaneous disruption at the network level and the facility level. Voss faces an information crisis and a security breach simultaneously. And if Voss's attention is on the information crisis, Wren said, following the logic, the security response to the facility breach is slower. Yes. She looked at him for a long moment. You have been building toward this specific architecture for a long time, she said. The architecture has been building itself, he said. I have been following it. She made a sound that was the first non-professional sound he had heard from her, something that was briefly, almost entirely, amused. Then she reached for the first of the labeled cases on the shelf behind her. I have 3 years of material, she said. The church's internal communication protocols as they existed when I left, and as I believe them to have evolved since. The Aldmark command station's layout, which my maintenance contact has been reconstructing from work orders for 2 years. Voss's research timeline and methodology, extrapolated from procurement records and personnel assignments. The collection point officer list with settlement assignments, and contact rotation schedules. She set the first case on the table. And one more thing. She reached to the back of the bottom shelf and produced a sealed cylinder, the kind used for waterproof document transport. She set it on the table beside the case. Durette, she said. She was not working alone when she came to you. She was working for me. The schematics she gave you were the portion of our shared work that I determined you could use immediately. The cylinder contains the rest of it. The portion I have been waiting for you to be ready to use. The fire, the highland wind, the small perfect sound of the spring outside. He looked at the cylinder for a moment. Then he looked at Wren. She knew she was in danger, he said. Yes. We both knew. Wren's expression did not change in any dramatic way, but the quality of it had something underneath it that was grief of the organized kind, the kind that had been lived with long enough to be manageable without being small. She wanted you to have everything. But she also knew that if you had everything at once, before you were operational, it would be a liability rather than an asset. So we divided it. He was quiet for a moment. She said, Wren continued, that she believed you would find your way here when you were ready. She said the specific phrase she used was, when he has found the people he needs. He looked at the 3 of them. Kale was very still, her ears up, her yellow gold eyes attentive. Sera had both hands flat on the table, looking at the cylinder with the focused attention of someone processing a significant reconfiguration of what they had understood. Vael was looking at him with those winter sky eyes, and what was in them was deep and quiet, and had the quality of a frequency that had found its resonance and was, for the moment, still. He reached for the cylinder. He opened it. He began to read. Outside, the highland wind moved across the Aldmark ridges in the patient way it had moved across those ridges since long before any of the things being planned in the small warm room had existed. The fire burned. The tea cooled. The afternoon moved toward evening, and 4 people and 1 woman who had been waiting for 3 years sat around a table with the full shape of what needed to be done spread out before them, and the 11-day window narrowed by 1 more hour with each hour that passed, and the work that needed to be done before the window closed was considerable and specific and entirely clear. They worked,